He had no reason to stop. The mountain road was a death trap. The storm was tearing itself apart above the Rockies. And 7 miles back, his 7-year-old daughter was asleep alone in their cabin, trusting that her father would come home. But Nathan Hale stopped anyway. And the moment he smashed through that half-buried SUV window with his bare elbow, the moment he saw a woman slumped unconscious against the steering wheel, blood threading down her temple like a crack in porcelain, everything he thought he knew about his quiet, finished little life cracked right along with it. If you've ever been rescued by a stranger, or if you've ever been the one doing the rescuing, stay with me. Because this story isn't just about a blizzard. It's about two people who were already broken before the storm ever started. Watch until the end. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it happened, Nathan wasn't supposed to be on Route 7 at all. His shift at the County Road Maintenance Depot had ended at 4 in the afternoon. Earlier than usual because his supervisor, a barrel-chested man named Doug Reeves, had taken one look at the weather radar and sent everyone home with a single sentence. Go be with your families before this thing swallows us whole. Nathan had laughed at that, not because it was funny, because he wasn't sure he still qualified as having a family in the traditional sense. There was Lily, of course, his daughter, 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with a stuffed rabbit named Captain Biscuit that had been washed so many times it had faded from brown to the color of old newspaper. Lily was his whole world, his North Star, the one thing that had kept him putting his boots on every morning for the past 4 years since Claire died. But a family? 2 people didn't feel like a family some nights. Some nights it just felt like 2 people trying not to drown in the same house. He'd left the depot at 4:15 and driven directly toward home, but then his truck's radio had crackled with a message from the county dispatch. A section of Route 7, just past the Granger Pass turnoff, had been reported as impassable due to a jackknifed logging truck. The secondary plow wasn't scheduled to reach it until morning, and if anyone slid off the road in the meantime and went down into the ravine on the east side of the pass, they weren't coming back up. Nathan wasn't on duty. He knew that. He also knew that nobody else was going out in this. He turned the truck around. That was the thing about Nathan Hale that most people misunderstood when they first met him. He was quiet usually, kept to himself, showed up to Lily's school events alone, and stood in the back and left early. Didn't come to the bar on Friday nights with the other plow guys. People sometimes mistook that quietness for coldness, or for someone who had simply given up caring about much of anything. But the truth was different. The truth was that Nathan cared about almost everything. He just didn't know how to say it out loud anymore. After Claire, words had stopped working right, so he showed up instead. He fixed things. He drove out in blizzards when nobody asked him to. Route 7 was brutal that night. The wind came sideways off the peaks and hit his truck broadside hard enough to make the whole vehicle shudder, and the snow was coming down so thick that his headlights reflected off it like he was driving into a wall of static. He had the plow blade down, pushing through the accumulation, and he was doing maybe 12 miles an hour and feeling like that was probably too fast. He almost missed it entirely. It was the reflection that caught him, a faint chrome glint from the right side of the road, just past the guardrail marker at milepost 44. He slowed, squinted through the windshield, and at first he thought it was just a road sign that had been knocked sideways by the wind. But the shape was wrong, too rounded, too large. He stopped the truck. He sat there for maybe 3 seconds, engine idling, wipers slapping furiously at the glass. Then he pulled on his heavy work gloves and his headlamp and got out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical thing. Not just cold, but violent, a temperature with genuine malice behind it. The wind knocked him sideways 2 steps, and he had to plant his feet wide and lean into it just to move forward. The snow was thigh-deep off the road edge, and he pushed through it with the slow, exhausting resistance of moving through wet cement. What he found was a black Range Rover, late model, expensive. It had left the road at what looked like a skid angle. Probably the rear had come around on black ice and the driver had overcorrected, and slid nose first into the snowbank on the ravine side of the road. The front end was buried up to the hood. The engine was off. One of the rear taillights was still blinking weakly, like a dying heartbeat. Nathan moved around to the driver's side. The window was intact but fogged from the inside, and he had to wipe the glass with his sleeve to see through it. The woman inside was slumped forward over the steering wheel, her face turned slightly to the right, her dark hair falling across most of her features. She wasn't moving. There was blood on her left temple. Not a tremendous amount, but enough. Her skin, what he could see of it, had a grayish quality that he didn't like. He tried the door handle. Locked. He tried it again, harder, in case it was just frozen. It didn't move. "Hey!" He knocked on the glass with his knuckle, then harder. "Hey, can you hear me? You need to wake up." Nothing. He looked back at his truck, then at the ravine drop that started maybe 8 feet beyond the buried front of the Range Rover, and he did the math very quickly. If she had hypothermia setting in, he had maybe minutes before the situation became unfixable. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away in perfect conditions. Tonight there were no perfect conditions. He used his elbow. One hard, angled strike at the rear passenger window. The point of his elbow rather than the flat, the way his father had taught him once, years ago, for exactly this kind of situation. And the glass didn't shatter so much as it crazed into 1,000 pebbled pieces that fell inward onto the leather seat. He reached through, unlocked the door from inside, and climbed through the rear to get to the front. She was breathing. That was the first thing he checked. 2 fingers against the side of her neck, and he felt a pulse that was there but too slow and too weak for his comfort. He moved her hair back from her face carefully and got a better look at the cut on her temple. Shallow, but head wounds always bled dramatically, and the cold had slowed even that. Her lips had a bluish undertone. Her hands, bare and ringless, were ice cold when he touched them. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Okay, let's do this." Getting her out was harder than it looked. She wasn't a small woman, probably 5'8", athletic build, and she was completely dead weight. He maneuvered her as carefully as he could out through the rear passenger door, one arm behind her back and one under her knees, trying not to jostle her head, any more than necessary in case she had a neck injury. He had no way of knowing, no way of checking properly out here, and every second he spent being cautious was a second she was spending in the cold. He made a judgment call. He moved her. Getting back to his truck through thigh-deep snow while carrying a full-grown unconscious woman was probably the hardest physical thing Nathan Hale had done in his adult life, and he'd spent the last decade operating heavy equipment in mountain winters. He stumbled twice. The second time he went down to one knee and felt the cold slice right through his work pants, and he swore out loud into the wind, a short, sharp word that got immediately torn away and scattered. And then he pushed back up and kept moving. He got her into the passenger seat of the truck cab. He turned the heat to maximum. He found the emergency blanket from his equipment kit behind the seat and wrapped it around her as best he could in the confined space. He looked at her face. Early 30s, maybe. Some kind of expensive coat that had probably kept her alive for as long as it did. Dark circles under her eyes, even through the pallor of cold. The kind of circles that came from chronic not sleeping, not from one bad night. Her face, even slack with unconsciousness, had a particular quality to it. A tension held in the jaw and around the eyes, like even in sleep she was arguing with something. Nathan had no idea who she was. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried the truck's radio. Static. The storm had eaten everything. The nearest town was Cedar Falls, population 1,200, about 15 miles west. But the road west was what he'd been plowing through, and he wasn't sure it was passable anymore. The wind had been building for the last hour, and by now the sections he'd already cleared might be filling back in. There was another option. His cabin. 3 miles east, up a service road that was rough in good weather and genuinely punishing in bad, but passable in his truck if he was careful. It wasn't a hard decision. Not really. He turned east. The service road was exactly as bad as he remembered. In places, the ruts were filled in completely, and he was navigating by memory, knowing where the road curved, where the drainage culvert dipped, where the stand of aspens started that meant he was getting close. The truck's four-wheel drive worked hard, and once, on a steep section, the rear end came around on him and he had to steer into the slide and hold his breath for a 3 count before the tires found traction again. Beside him, the woman hadn't moved. "You picked a hell of a night," he said to her. Not expecting an answer, just filling the silence, because the silence out here on nights like this had a weight to it that he'd never quite gotten used to. Route 7, in February, in a car with road tires, I'm guessing. The cabin came into view at the top of the last rise, a smear of warm amber light through the snow that meant the lamp he'd left on in the front room was still burning. He'd built the habit of leaving it on when he went to work, not for any romantic reason, just so Lily would have a light if she woke up in the night and got scared. He parked as close to the porch as he could, killed the engine, and sat for a moment just breathing. Then he got her out again and carried her inside. The cabin was warm. He'd stoked the wood stove before leaving that morning, and it had been running on low all day, the thermally efficient kind that could hold its heat for 14 hours on a good load of seasoned oak. The interior temperature was probably 65 degrees. Not hot, but after what they'd both just come through, it felt like stepping into an oven. He laid her on the couch in the front room, the long leather one that had been his wife's choice and that he'd kept because Lily liked to sleep on it during movie nights. He added 2 wool blankets from the cedar chest and started methodically working to warm her up. Not too fast, because he knew from training that rewarming too quickly could be dangerous, but steadily, systematically. He took her wet coat off, her boots, her outer layers, down to a cashmere sweater and leggings that were damp at the edges but not soaked through. He replaced them with dry things from his own closet, a heavy flannel shirt, wool socks, with the impersonal efficiency of someone doing what needed to be done, not thinking about anything beyond the task. He boiled water, made it into a hot water bottle wrapped in a dish towel, and placed it against her core. He sat in the armchair across from her and watched her color and her breathing, checking her pulse every few minutes against his watch. Around 9 o'clock, she made a sound. It wasn't words, just a small, involuntary noise, something between a groan and a sharp breath, and her head turned to one side and her eyes moved under their lids. Nathan sat forward. "Hey, take it easy. You're safe. You're inside." She didn't wake fully for another 20 minutes. When she did, it was not a gentle movie-style return to consciousness. It was confused and uncomfortable and slightly panicked. Her eyes opened and immediately tried to make sense of the ceiling. Pine boards, a single exposed beam, a smoke-darkened light fixture, and found nothing that matched any interior she'd ever been in. She tried to sit up. He put a hand on her shoulder, light but firm. "Don't. Not yet." She looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and right now they were doing a lot of rapid, scared processing. Her voice came out rough, barely usable. She swallowed and tried again. "Where am I?" "My cabin. About 3 miles east of Route 7, off the county service road." "How did I—" "You went off the road. Black ice, probably, past Granger Pass. Your SUV is in a snowbank." She was quiet for a moment, trying to reconstruct the night. He could see her doing it, her eyes going distant, her brow pulling together. "I was trying to get to—" She stopped. "I was driving." "Yeah." "There was a curve and I felt the back go and She touched the left side of her head and winced. "You hit something when the car stopped. The wound's not deep, but it bled some. How's your vision? Any doubling?" She blinked experimentally. "No." "Nausea?" "Some. Not bad." "Neck pain?" She moved her head carefully left and right. "Stiff. Not sharp." He let out a breath he hadn't entirely realized he'd been holding. "Okay? That's okay?" He stood. "I'll get you some water. Stay flat for now." "Wait!" She grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who'd been hypothermic 20 minutes ago. "Who are you?" "Nathan Hale. I plow roads for the county." She stared at him. Something moved through her expression. He couldn't quite read it. "You found me out there?" "Saw your taillight. Almost didn't." She let go of his wrist. She lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling again, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We're still stuck here. Storm's not going anywhere tonight." He got her the water. She drank it slowly, carefully, the way someone does when they're not quite sure their body is going to cooperate. He made her stay lying down while he checked the wood stove, added 2 pieces of oak, looked out the window at the storm. The wind was picking up, if anything. The snow had passed vertical. It was moving at about a 30-degree angle, slamming against the north-facing wall of the cabin in rhythmic gusts. "I'm Victoria. she said from behind him. I know. He turned. Your driver's license. I checked when I was warming you up to see if there was emergency contact information. She absorbed this. And? Your emergency contact is a law firm. Something crossed her face then. It was fast, and she covered it quickly, but he caught it. A flash of something that looked less like embarrassment and more like confirmation of something she'd already known about herself. That's, she started, stopped. That makes sense, actually. He didn't respond to that. It felt like the kind of thing that needed space around it, not a reply. He went and checked on Lily. His daughter's bedroom was down the short hallway, and he pushed the door open quietly and stood in the gap for a moment. She was asleep on her side, Captain Biscuit tucked under her chin, her dark hair splayed across the pillow. She'd kicked most of her blanket onto the floor, which was completely normal, and he picked it up and laid it back over her without waking her. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. I brought a stranger home, he thought. A stranger I pulled out of a snowstorm who has no emergency contact except a law firm. He looked at his daughter's face, soft and unbothered in sleep. What am I doing? The answer, he knew, was the same thing he'd always done. The next right thing. That was all. You couldn't see further than that in a storm this bad, either literally or otherwise. When he came back to the front room, Victoria had carefully pushed herself up to sitting. She looked like it had cost her something, but she was upright. She'd pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders, and she was looking around the cabin with those dark, assessing eyes. The cabin was not impressive by most standards. It was functional. A single open space for the living area and kitchen, 2 bedrooms off a short hallway, 1 bathroom. The furniture was mismatched in the way of a place where things had been acquired based on need rather than aesthetic. The leather couch, a wooden kitchen table with 4 chairs where only 2 were ever used, a set of bookshelves along the east wall that were genuinely overloaded, books stacked sideways on top of standing books, paperbacks jammed into every available gap. On the kitchen counter, a child's drawing held to the refrigerator by a magnet. A house, 2 figures, 1 tall and 1 small, with what was probably intended to be a dog, but looked more like an oval with legs. You have a child, Victoria said. Not a question. Daughter, 7. She's asleep. I'm sorry to intrude on your... You didn't intrude. You crashed. He sat back down in the armchair. Are you warm enough? Getting there. She looked at the flannel shirt she was wearing. His flannel shirt, a dark green one, large enough on her that it looked more like a short dress. Something moved in her expression again, but this time he thought it might be something closer to strange amusement. I should mention that I'm perfectly capable of being uncomfortable without needing someone to manage it. He looked at her. I didn't say anything. You have a particular look. What look? The one where you're measuring whether I'm going to fall apart. Nathan considered this. Fair, he said finally. Are you? No. Good. He leaned back. Because I don't actually know what I'd do with that. That was the first moment anything approaching real amusement appeared on her face. It was a brief thing, barely there, the corner of her mouth pulling up slightly before the tension in her jaw reasserted itself. But it was real. That much was clear. The storm hammered the north wall. They sat in the particular silence of 2 strangers who have already skipped the small talk by virtue of emergency, and who are now in the slightly awkward aftermath of that emergency, where normal social conventions haven't yet been renegotiated. Victoria broke it first. You said we're stuck here. Roads are impassable. Storms forecast to run through tomorrow night minimum. My phone, Ike, no signal. Mine either. The storm knocked out the relay on the ridge. It happens up here. She absorbed this with a stillness that impressed him slightly. Most people, told they were stranded in a stranger's mountain cabin with no phone signal in the middle of a blizzard, would have some kind of reaction. She just sat with it. So, she said. So, what do we do? Nathan looked at the wood stove, looked at the window where snow was streaming past at 45-degree angles, looked back at her. Tonight, we stay warm and you rest. Tomorrow we figure out if anything's changed. She nodded, once, crisply, like someone accepting a meeting agenda, and for a second he almost laughed. because there was something both completely absurd and completely genuine about it. This woman who was apparently used to running things, sitting in his dead wife's flannel shirt in a cabin in the Rockies, nodding at the plan like she was approving a quarterly strategy. "One thing," he said. "What?" "My daughter. When she wakes up tomorrow—" He stopped, finding the words. "She's 7. Her mom died 4 years ago. She's a good kid, but she doesn't love surprises." Victoria looked at him steadily. "What do you want me to do?" "Let me tell her first. In the morning, before she comes out and finds a stranger on the couch." "Of course. And don't—" He paused again. "Don't try too hard with her. She notices." Something in Victoria's expression shifted. It wasn't offense, it was more like recognition. Like he'd said something she hadn't expected to be said plainly, and the plainness of it had landed somewhere real. "Understood," she said. He nodded. "Blankets are in the cedar chest by the window, bathrooms down the hall on the left. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen, but the granola is Lily's. She's unreasonably protective of it." "Noted." He stood, picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. "I'm going to check the woodpile. Make sure we have enough for tomorrow. It's almost midnight." "I know what time it is." He didn't wait for a response. He went out into the storm, the blast of cold and wind hitting him like a door swung open into traffic, and he stood on the covered porch for a moment before moving to the woodpile, his headlamp cutting a weak tunnel through the driving snow. The truth was, he'd needed a minute. Just a minute. Because something about the last 3 hours had accumulated into a feeling he didn't entirely know what to do with. Not romantic, nothing like that. He wasn't 17 years old, but something, some kind of awareness of the strangeness of this night, of the degree to which a single glint of chrome in a snowstorm had shifted the course of something. Of the woman sitting in his front room, in his late wife's usual armchair-adjacent couch, wearing his shirt, with her law firm emergency contact and her jaw tension, and that brief, barely there moment of almost amusement. He stood there in the cold until his ears started to hurt. Then he grabbed an armload of wood and went back inside. Victoria was asleep. She'd stretched out on the couch, one arm folded under her head as a pillow, the wool blanket pulled up over her shoulder. The tension in her jaw was gone. In sleep, she looked younger, and somehow less certain of things, and Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment with the armload of wood and just looked at her. Then he loaded the wood stove, turned the lamp down low, and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. Lily found out at 7:15 the next morning, and it did not go the way he'd planned. He'd woken at 6:30, dressed quietly, and gone to check on Victoria, still sleeping, before going to the kitchen to start coffee. He'd had a plan. Wake Lily, tell her gently that a woman had gotten hurt in the storm and was staying with them until it passed, answer her questions, let her set the pace. What actually happened was that Lily woke at 7, padded out into the hallway, still carrying Captain Biscuit, and walked directly into the front room before Nathan heard her door open. He heard the pause from the kitchen, that specific silence of a child who has seen something unexpected. He came around the corner. Lily was standing in the entrance to the front room in her pajamas, the ones with the cartoon foxes on them, staring at the couch. Victoria had just opened her eyes and was in the process of orienting herself, doing that reconstruction thing again, remembering where she was. The two of them looked at each other. Nathan started to say something. Neither of them appeared to hear him. "You're in my spot," Lily said. Victoria blinked. "I'm sorry?" "That couch. That's where I sit for movie nights." Lily's tone was entirely factual, not hostile. She was 7, and 7-year-olds had not yet learned to add performative diplomacy to declarative statements. "I didn't know," Victoria said. "I would have chosen differently." Lily considered this. She looked at the woman, then at her father, then back at the woman. "You're wearing Daddy's shirt." "I am." "Why?" "Because mine was wet." Another considering pause. Lily shifted Captain Biscuit from one arm to the other. "Your head has a bruise. I had a small accident last night. Your father helped me." "He's good at helping," Lily said, with the simple confidence of someone reporting a known fact. Then she turned and walked into the kitchen. "Daddy, is there school?" Nathan exhaled. No, baby. Storm day. Can I have the granola? He looked at Victoria. Victoria's mouth was doing the corner-pulling thing again, the not-quite smile. Yeah, he called after his daughter. You can have the granola. The day passed in the particular rhythm of enforced confinement. The storm didn't ease. If anything, by noon it had intensified. The wind was coming at the cabin from multiple directions, which meant it had moved into the rotational phase that happened when two systems collided over the peaks, and Nathan had seen this kind before. It could last another 18 hours. It could last 48. There was no way to know. He kept the wood stove going. He made breakfast, eggs and toast for all three of them, because it was what he had. And Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the slightly awkward air of someone accustomed to having a very different kind of morning. He noticed she drank her coffee black and finished it in 4 deliberate swallows rather than sipping it. He noticed she sat with her back to the wall and facing the door, the way certain kinds of people always sat. He noticed she watched Lily with a quality of attention that wasn't intrusive, wasn't performing interest, but was genuinely observational, the way you watch something you found unexpected and were trying to understand. Lily was characteristically oblivious to being observed. She ate her granola and read a library book about horses, and at one point announced to no one in particular that horses could sleep standing up, which she found deeply unfair given that she was not allowed to sleep sitting up at the dinner table. Who made that rule? Victoria asked. Lily looked at her. Daddy, did you argue it? I said it wasn't fair because horses do it. What did he say? He said horses don't have dinner tables. Lily considered this. That's not really an answer. No, Victoria said. It isn't. Nathan, who was washing dishes with his back to both of them, said nothing. But something in his chest did a small, complicated thing that he didn't examine too closely. The afternoon got harder. Not between the people, that was, if anything, finding an odd rhythm, but physically. The temperature dropped. Nathan went out twice to check the fuel tank for the backup generator, and once to shore up the tarp over the woodpile that was threatening to go in the wind. Each time he came in, he was colder than the time before, and the second time his hands took a while to stop shaking, even after he was back inside. Victoria watched this without comment until the third time he reached up to hang his jacket, and his hands fumbled the hook twice. Then she stood, crossed the kitchen, took the jacket from him, and hung it herself. I'm fine, he said. I didn't say anything. You didn't need to. She looked at him for a moment. Close up, he noticed the bruise on her temple had developed into a fairly spectacular color, dark purple-red shading to greenish at the edges. It looked painful. Is there any first aid for that? He asked, nodding at her head. I had a headache this morning. It's better now. She paused. I've had worse. Worse than a head injury in a blizzard? I once broke 2 ribs in a rock climbing accident in Chile and didn't tell anyone because I had a board presentation 3 days later. He stared at her. I'm not saying it was a good decision, she said. Did you give the presentation? We raised $40 million. Nathan turned back to the stove where the soup he'd started was beginning to smell ready. That's insane. Probably, she agreed. She sat back down at the table. I'm aware it's insane. There was a quality to that admission. Not proud, not self-deprecating in a performed way, just flat, like she was reading a fact off a page. That made him glance back at her. She was looking at the table. The board, she said. They don't actually care, about the person. They care about the numbers. You learn that, and then you just... She stopped. Picked up her coffee mug, which was cold now, looked into it. You perform health. You perform being fine. You get good enough at it that eventually you can't tell where the performance ends. Nathan didn't respond immediately. He got the soup bowls down from the cabinet and ladled out 2 adult portions and 1 child-sized one. Lily, he called. Soup! Running feet from the hallway, he set the bowls on the table and sat down, and for a few minutes there was just the small domestic sound of eating, Lily blowing on her soup, the wind against the walls, the tick and settle of the wood stove. Then Lily looked up at Victoria and said, Were you scared when you crashed? Victoria met her eyes. Yes, I was very scared. Were you scared when you woke up and didn't know where you were? Also, yes. Lily thought about this, dunking a piece of bread into her soup with solemn concentration. I get scared sometimes, she said, when Daddy's at work and it's a storm. What do you do when that happens? I hold Captain Biscuit. Lily held up the rabbit, who had apparently joined them for lunch. And I think about what Daddy said. What did he say? Lily recited it with the cadence of something memorized but not yet outgrown. That fear means you love something and you don't want to lose it. And that's not a bad thing. That's just what love feels like from the outside. Victoria set her spoon down. She looked across the table at Nathan with an expression he couldn't fully read, complicated and layered, and maybe a little bit like something had gone in somewhere it hadn't been invited. He shrugged slightly. It's what my dad said to me. I passed it on. It's accurate, she said, quietly. Most old things are. After dinner, Lily fell asleep on the couch, her spot reclaimed, and Nathan covered her with the blanket and turned the lamp down and then went and stood in the kitchen doorway because the main room was now occupied and the kitchen was where the chairs were. Victoria was already there. She'd found an unread paperback from the bookshelves, a Western novel with a battered spine, the kind his father used to read, and was sitting at the table with it open, but she wasn't reading. She was looking at the cover without seeing it. He sat across from her. Outside, the storm was doing something new, a lower, sustained howl that meant the wind had stabilized at a dangerous speed rather than gusting, more consistent, which in some ways was worse. What was her name? Victoria asked. She was still looking at the book cover. Your wife. Claire. The name still had a particular weight in his mouth. Not painful exactly, not anymore, just substantial. Like a stone you'd picked up so many times you could feel every edge. She was a teacher, 3rd grade. Victoria looked up. She was... He stopped because the usual words didn't feel right. He tried again. She was a pain in the ass, honestly, opinionated, argued about everything, had to be right, which she usually was, which made it worse. He paused. She was the best person I've ever known. Those two things were completely compatible. Victoria smiled. A real one this time. Small, a little sad, but real. What happened? Aneurysm. She went to sleep and didn't wake up. 31 years old, no symptoms, nothing. Victoria was quiet. Lily was 3, he said. She doesn't really remember her. I tell her stories, show her pictures. But the person she knows as her mom is mostly, he tapped his temple, assembled. You know? How do you do that? Victoria said. Tell those stories without it destroying you every time. It used to. He looked at the wood stove, the fire visible through the small isinglass window. You build up scar tissue, I guess. It still hurts, but it hurts differently. More like a reminder than a wound. She held the book in both hands, not reading it, just holding it. My brother died, she said. 3 years ago, cancer. He was 34. Nathan looked at her. His name was Daniel. She said it carefully, the same way he'd said Claire. He was the only person who called me Vicky. Everyone else always called me Victoria. I'm a Victoria professionally. It sounds serious. It closes down certain kinds of condescension. But Daniel called me Vicky from when we were kids and never stopped, even when I told him it was embarrassing. She paused. I'd give a lot to hear it now. I know that feeling. When he died, She set the book down. I threw myself into work. Completely. Built the company from 40 million to 400 million in 18 months. Everyone called it my Phoenix moment, this incredible display of focus and drive. Something dry and uncomfortable moved through her voice. Nobody mentioned that what I was actually doing was making sure I never had a free moment to feel anything. That I was essentially running from one task to the next, because if I ever stopped running, I was going to fall. Have you stopped running? She looked around the cabin, the walls, the wood stove, the sleeping child on the couch visible through the doorway. Tonight, apparently. The blizzard helps, he said. Yes? A pause. Inconvenient timing. He almost laughed. The almost laugh came out as a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite not. And she heard it, and something in her posture eased slightly, the way a room eases when a window is opened. Your daughter, she said. She's remarkable. She's 7. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. He conceded this with a slight tilt of his head. She's going to be terrifying when she's older. She already negotiates like a lawyer. I know several lawyers who couldn't negotiate as well as she just handled me occupying her couch spot. He did laugh then. A short one. Quiet, so as not to wake Lily, but real. It felt strange in his chest, the way something feels when it hasn't been used in a while. Not bad, just unfamiliar. At 11 o'clock, the wind shifted. Nathan heard it, a change in pitch, a new direction, and then a sound from the roof that was not good. A groan, deep and structural, the sound of load bearing in a way it wasn't designed to. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. What was that? Victoria was already standing too. Too much accumulation on the north side of the roof. He grabbed his headlamp. The pitch isn't steep enough there. I've been worried about it. He went out the back door and around, and the headlamp showed him what he'd feared. The snow on the north-facing section of the roof had built up into a mass that had to be 3 feet deep, and it was sitting wrong, shifted to one side by the wind change, and the boards beneath it were expressing their unhappiness in an audible, continuous way. He came back inside. His face must have said something because Victoria took one look at him and said, "How bad?" "I need to get Lily up," he said. "We need to move to the back bedroom, the one on the south side. Now." "How long do we have?" He listened to the roof. Not long. Victoria moved first. She was down the hallway before he was, and when he got there she was already crouched next to the couch, one hand on Lily's shoulder, speaking in a low, steady voice. "Lily. Hey. Lily, I need you to wake up. Your dad needs us to move, okay?" Lily blinked up at her, blurry with sleep. "What? Come on, I'll carry you." Victoria scooped her up before Nathan could react, and Lily, operating on the confused trust of a child barely awake, put her arms around Victoria's neck without protest and allowed herself to be carried down the hallway to the back bedroom. Nathan grabbed blankets, the emergency kit, the lantern. He was 3 steps behind them. He had just reached the hallway when the north section of the roof came down. The sound was enormous. Not a crash so much as a continuous, catastrophic settling, snow and timber together, the front room ceiling folding inward under a weight it had never been built to hold. Cold air and snow debris blasted down the hallway like a pressure wave, and Nathan put his arm up to shield his face and kept moving. He made it to the back bedroom, pulled the door closed behind him, stood in the dark for a moment, breathing. "Daddy?" Lily's voice, small but not panicking. "Good girl." "I'm here." He turned on the lantern. The back bedroom was intact. South-facing, properly pitched roof. No accumulation issues. The blast of cold from the collapsed section was seeping under the door, but it was manageable. He pushed a rolled blanket against the door gap and turned to look at his daughter. She was sitting on the bed, still holding Captain Biscuit, looking at him with enormous eyes. Victoria was sitting beside her with one arm loosely around her shoulders. Not clutching, not performing comfort, just there. "The front room collapsed?" Victoria asked. "Most of it. The kitchen section might be okay." He sat on the floor across from them, back against the wall, and looked at the ceiling. Solid. No sounds. "We're okay in here." "Okay," Lily said. She said it like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she lay down on the bed and pulled the blanket up. "Is Captain Biscuit okay?" Nathan looked at the threadbare rabbit in her arms. "Captain Biscuit is completely fine." "Okay," she said again, and closed her eyes. He met Victoria's gaze above his daughter's head. She looked, for the first time since he'd found her in the wreckage of her SUV, genuinely shaken. Not terrified, not falling apart, but shaken. The composed surface with something moving underneath it that was real and unmanaged. "She's incredible," Victoria said, barely audible. "I know," he said. They sat on opposite sides of the bed with Lily between them as the storm did its worst to the cabin around them, and the lantern burned, and outside the wind sang its indifferent mountain song, and somewhere in the wreckage of the front room the wood stove continued to hold its heat. Nathan watched his daughter sleep. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way love could be assembled from stories and photographs when the original was gone, and how that assembled version was somehow still real, still warm, still specific, still able to make you ache when you weren't expecting it. He thought about a woman saying, "I'd give a lot to hear it now," about her brother's name for her that nobody else still used. He thought about the sound the roof had made. He thought about how many seconds had been between him still being in the front room and the ceiling coming down, and how thin that margin had been, and how completely random, and how little of anything that mattered had anything to do with deserving or not deserving it. Eventually he stopped thinking and just sat there, in the dark and the warmth and the storm, with the lantern throwing orange light across the faces of the two people in the room with him. He didn't know what any of this was. He only knew that it wasn't nothing. The night passed the way bad nights do, not quickly, not with any mercy, but in slow, grinding increments that made each hour feel like it had been stretched past what hours were designed to hold. Nathan didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall beside the bed, the lantern turned to its lowest setting so Lily could rest, and he listened to the storm work on what was left of his cabin, the way you'd listen to something you loved being taken apart piece by piece and couldn't do anything about. Every so often there would be a new sound from the collapsed front section, a groan, a settling shift, once a sound like something heavy sliding, and each time his body would go tight and he'd track it until it resolved into silence again. Victoria didn't sleep either. He knew because her breathing never changed into the slow, unconscious rhythm of actual rest. And once, around 2 a.m, she said quietly into the dark, "The temperature in here is dropping." "I know." He'd felt it too, a gradual, insistent creep that the rolled blanket at the door gap was slowing but not stopping. The back bedroom had no wood stove, no secondary heat source. The cabin's central heat had died with the front section. What they had was 2 adults, 1 child, and a pile of wool blankets. "We should put her between us," Victoria said. "Conserve body heat." He didn't answer right away because the practical logic was obvious, and he was working out whether some other part of him had any objection to it. He decided it didn't. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He moved to the bed. Lily stirred but didn't fully wake when he repositioned her toward the center, and Nathan lay down on one side of her and Victoria on the other, and they pulled the blankets over all 3 of them, and that was that. Lily, with the unconscious thermal intelligence of small children everywhere, immediately migrated toward the warmest thing available, which turned out to be Victoria, and burrowed her head against Victoria's shoulder without waking. Victoria went very still. Nathan watched her face in the low lantern light. She was looking at the ceiling, and whatever was happening behind her eyes was too layered to read, but her arm came up slowly and settled around Lily's back with a carefulness that looked like someone handling something they were afraid to break. "She does this," he said quietly. "She finds the warmest spot." "I don't mind," Victoria said. Her voice was different, lower, some of the controlled surface quality gone out of it. "I don't mind at all." He lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the storm and didn't say anything else. After a while, the temperature stopped dropping, or at least stopped feeling like it was dropping, and Lily's small warmth between them worked in both directions, and the lantern burned its quiet orange, and Nathan found himself in the strange country between sleep and waking where thoughts moved without his permission. He thought about the roof, about how he'd put off having that north section reinforced for 2 winters running because there was always something else. The truck needing work, Lily's school fees, the cost of seasoned lumber going up. He thought about how the list of things he'd put off had gotten longer each year since Claire died, not because he was lazy, but because there were only so many hours and only one of him, and triage was a skill you developed whether you wanted to or not. He thought about Victoria saying, "I was essentially running from one task to the next because if I ever stopped running, I was going to fall." He recognized that. He wouldn't have used those words for himself, but he recognized the architecture of it, the way busyness could be a structure you built specifically to keep certain rooms sealed off. He'd done the same thing, different building, same principle. He wasn't sure when he fell asleep, but he did, eventually, because he woke to gray light coming through the frost-edged window and Lily sitting up between them, looking from his face to Victoria's with the focused attention of someone conducting a study. "You're both asleep," she announced, to no one in particular. "Was," Nathan said without opening his eyes. "Victoria's asleep." Let her sleep. A pause. The particular silence of a 7-year-old deciding whether to comply. Is the front room still broken? Yes. Can I see it? No. Why? He opened his eyes. Lily was looking at him with the expression she used when she was planning to continue asking variations of the same question until she got a different answer. Because it's not safe, and it's cold, and you'd have to go past the door, and I said no. She evaluated this. Okay. She lay back down, then immediately back up. I'm hungry. I know. What are we going to eat? Give me 10 minutes. He sat up carefully. Victoria's eyes were open. She hadn't been asleep or had woken when Lily started talking. She looked at him over Lily's head with an expression that was doing several things at once, asking if he was okay, acknowledging the situation, something else he couldn't quite name. He gave her a short nod and got up. The hallway was cold, noticeably colder than the bedroom, the damage from the collapsed section having opened the cabin's thermal envelope in ways he'd need to properly assess in daylight. He pulled the door to the back bedroom mostly closed to keep the warmth in and moved down the hall. The kitchen was intact. The front room was not. He stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at what the night had done. The north-facing portion of the front room roof had come down in a mass of snow-laden timber that had taken the ceiling with it, and the debris field extended to about the midpoint of the room, meaning the couch, the cedar chest, most of his bookshelves, and 4 years' worth of accumulated living were buried under several tons of snow and broken wood. The leather couch, Claire's couch, was somewhere under there. He looked at the debris pile for a moment and felt a dull, tired grief that had nothing dramatic in it, just the flat weight of one more thing gone. The kitchen was fine. The wood stove, which sat in the transitional space between kitchen and front room, was on the kitchen side of the collapse line and miraculously intact. The chimney pipe ran up through the kitchen ceiling rather than the front section, so if it hadn't been knocked out of alignment, it might still be usable. He checked it. It was fine. He got the fire going again, but the embers had survived the night, buried under ash, and it took him 15 minutes of careful work with kindling to coax them back into something real. When the fire caught, and he felt the first radiation of actual heat coming off the cast iron, he sat back on his heels and exhaled. Okay. They had heat. They had the kitchen. They had food for at least 3 more days, maybe 4 if he was careful. They had the back bedroom. What they didn't have was a front room, or running water. The pipes in the collapsed section would be compromised, or any way to know when the storm was going to end, or when anyone was going to come looking. He filled a pot with snow from just inside the back door and set it on the stove to melt for water. He found eggs, found bread, found the block of cheese in the back of the refrigerator that still had another week on it. He started breakfast. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway with both blankets from the bed wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair loose and unmanaged, the bruise on her temple now at peak color. She looked at what he'd accomplished with the wood stove, and something in her face unclenched. You got it going, she said. Yeah. She came in and stood by the stove with her hands out toward the heat, not saying anything for a moment, just absorbing warmth. He cracked eggs into the pan. Lily still in bed? He asked. She's teaching Captain Biscuit about structural engineering. Apparently the rabbit needs to understand why roofs fall down. Nathan looked at the pan. She's processing. She seems pretty steady. She's had to be. He moved the eggs around in the pan. She's better at it than I am, honestly, at just accepting what is and moving forward. I'm still standing here looking at where my front room used to be. Victoria turned to look at the debris through the kitchen doorway. She was quiet for a moment. Can it be rebuilt? The cabin? Yeah, it's repairable. The bones are good. My grandfather built it. He didn't mess around with materials. It'll need a structural assessment and new timber for the north section, and obviously new interior work, but it's fixable. He paused. Everything's fixable if you're not trying to put it back exactly the way it was. She turned back to look at him. He hadn't meant for that to sound like anything more than a construction observation, but it had come out with a particular weight that they both noticed and neither acknowledged directly. Breakfast ready soon? She asked. 5 minutes. She found the coffee without being told, which suggested she'd paid attention the night before, and got it going. They worked in the kitchen together with the slightly careful coordination of two people who aren't sure of each other's habits and are mapping them in real time. He moved to the left. She compensated right. He reached for the cabinet, and she was already moving out of the way. It was slightly awkward in the way of people who are used to occupying their spaces alone. Lily arrived at some point during this, still carrying Captain Biscuit, and climbed into a chair at the table and watched both adults move around the kitchen with an expression of frank scientific interest. "You're like bumper cars," she observed. "We're managing," Nathan said. "Victoria almost stepped on your foot twice." "I noticed," Victoria said. "You didn't say sorry either time." "Lily," Nathan said, "I'm just saying." "I know you're just saying." Victoria set down the coffee mugs and turned to look at Lily with a completely straight face. "You're right. I should have apologized." She looked at Nathan. "I'm sorry I almost stepped on your foot." "Twice," Lily added. "Twice," Victoria agreed. Nathan put the eggs on the table and sat down and looked at the two of them looking at each other and felt, in the middle of everything, the collapsed roof, the storm, the cold, the uncertainty, a brief and uncomplicated moment of something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite tenderness and was maybe both at once. They ate. The eggs were good. Outside, the storm continued, but something about the sound of it was different that morning. Less of the rotational howl from the night before, more of a straight-line push, which meant the two systems had stopped colliding and one had taken over. That was usually a sign the back end of it was coming, which meant an end was at least theoretically within sight. After breakfast, Lily wanted to know if she could help clean up. "Sure," Nathan said. "You can dry." She dried dishes with the focused solemnity she applied to tasks she'd decided were serious, and Victoria washed, and Nathan stacked, and nobody said much. The domesticity of it was strange enough that he noticed it. Not uncomfortable, just strange. This was not a configuration his mornings usually came in. When they were done, Lily looked at Victoria and said, "What do you do? Like for your job?" Victoria dried her hands on the dish towel. "I run a technology company." "What does that mean?" "It means I have a lot of meetings and make decisions about where money goes." Lily considered this. "That sounds boring." "Sometimes it is." "Do you like it?" Victoria paused. He noticed the pause. It was longer than the question seemed to warrant and had a quality of genuine reckoning to it rather than adult hedging. "I used to," she said. "I'm less sure now." Lily accepted this with a nod, the way children accept honest answers that they can tell are honest. "Daddy likes his job," she offered, "even when it's cold. He says the mountains don't care if you're having a bad day, which he says is actually nice." "He said that?" "He says a lot of things. I remember most of them." She picked up Captain Biscuit from the chair where he'd been resting during dish duties. "I'm going to go draw. The rabbit needs a picture of the cabin before it was broken." She disappeared down the hallway. Nathan watched her go, then looked at his coffee. "She's archiving it," Victoria said, "before it changes." "Yeah." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "She does that. When Claire died, she drew every room in the house, every single one, over about 2 weeks. I still have them." Victoria sat down across from him. "Did she tell you why?" "She said she wanted to remember where things were." He looked at the mug. "She was 3. I didn't even know she knew what remember meant in that context. She knew. She knew." Outside, the wind shifted again, but this time it was quieter afterward, not louder. The cabin walls stopped their constant shuddering and settled into something closer to stillness, the kind that felt provisional but real. Nathan tilted his head and listened. "It's changing," he said. Victoria listened too. "Is that good?" "I think the back end's coming through. Maybe another 8 to 12 hours and we could see a break. And then? Road crews will start working. Phones might come back. Could be rescue teams out looking." He set down the mug. "Someone's going to be looking for you." She was quiet for a moment. "My assistant knows my general route. She'll have flagged it by now. Anyone else?" She turned the coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. "My CFO, probably, because we had a call scheduled for yesterday morning. My legal team, because we have a filing deadline next week." A pause. "That's about it on the actively worried front." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. It's not, she started, then stopped. Tried again. I built that deliberately. The isolation. I told myself it was efficiency. No personal entanglements, no one expecting things from you that conflict with what needs to get done. I told myself Daniel would have understood. She looked at the table. Daniel would have called it exactly what it was. He'd have said, "Vicky, you built a beautiful cage and you're very proud of it." And then he'd have wanted to get lunch. Nathan looked at her. He sounds like he was a pain in the ass, and she laughed. An actual laugh, surprised out of her, short and real. The most spectacular pain in the ass. He once told a room full of my investors that I needed to go outside more. During a pitch meeting. Did it hurt the pitch? They loved him. They almost funded him instead. Her smile faded slowly, the way smiles do when the memory behind them has a shadow. He was the kind of person who made every room better just by being in it. The kind you don't know how to account for until they're gone, and suddenly every room is missing something you can't name. Nathan thought about Claire at the kitchen table, arguing about whether The Shining was a horror movie or a family drama, completely serious about it, getting louder as she got more invested. He thought about the specific quality of her laugh, which had always started a half second before anything was actually funny because she laughed in anticipation. He thought about how he couldn't quite reconstruct her voice anymore, not exactly, not the precise timbre of it, and how that loss sat alongside everything else like a quiet, permanent bruise. "I know," he said. "I know exactly what that feels like." She looked at him. There was a quality to the silence that followed. Not awkward, not weighted in the way of two people about to say something they shouldn't. Just the particular quality of two people who have recognized the same wound in each other and are sitting with that recognition instead of immediately trying to dress it. The morning stretched into afternoon without the kind of incident the previous day had brought. The storm's back end was quieter, less violent, more committed to attrition, coming straight down now in heavy curtains of snowfall rather than the sideways assault of the day before. Nathan cleared what he could of the debris from the hallway junction, working carefully and not past the point where the remaining structure looked questionable. Victoria helped without being asked, which surprised him slightly, not because he'd expected her to refuse, but because the help was genuinely useful rather than performative. She had a practical spatial intelligence that he hadn't anticipated, a way of seeing where things needed to go and moving them there without needing direction. "You've done physical work before," he said at one point when she'd shifted a beam section that he'd been about to do himself. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Vermont. Before the tech career, before everything. My parents grew apples." She set the beam down. "I left when I was 18, and I've spent most of the time since then trying to not seem like I grew up on a farm." "Why?" She brushed splinters off her palms. Silicon Valley has a very specific kind of snobbishness. It's not about money. Everyone has money. It's about a particular kind of origin story, the prodigy angle, the MIT dorm room angle. Apple farmer's daughter doesn't fit any of the archetypes. "Does it bother you, the hiding it?" She was quiet for a moment, stacking smaller debris pieces. "It did. Now it just seems exhausting. I've been exhausted by a lot of things recently." They worked in silence for a while after that. Lily appeared periodically from the bedroom hallway with questions or observations, once to inform them that Captain Biscuit had decided the collapse was probably the wind's fault, once to request something to drink, once simply to stand in the hallway and watch them work with an expression of elderly approval before retreating. Around 2 in the afternoon, Nathan made soup from canned tomatoes and the last of the dried pasta, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the wood stove working hard against the cold that was still infiltrating from the damaged section. The temperature in the kitchen and back bedroom was manageable. The rest of the cabin was not habitable. "How long have you been up here?" Victoria asked, between spoonfuls. "In the mountains." "My whole life, basically. My grandfather built this cabin in the 60s. My dad grew up here, I grew up here. I left for 3 years when I was 19, went to Denver, worked construction, thought I was going to do something different." He broke a piece of bread. "Came back when my dad got sick. Ended up staying, married Claire, got the county job, had Lily." He set the bread down. "It doesn't sound like much from the outside." "It sounds like enough." Some days it does. He looked at Lily, who was eating with focused concentration, building a tiny dam of pasta across one side of her bowl for reasons known only to her. Other days it feels like I stopped, like I was going somewhere and I just stopped. You didn't stop, Victoria said. You redirected. There's a motivational poster version of that. I know. I'm not doing the motivational poster version. She looked at him directly, that unsoftened directness he was starting to recognize as just how she talked when she wasn't managing something. You built a life in impossible circumstances. You kept a child whole. You drove out in a blizzard when nobody asked you to because a section of road needed plowing. That's not stopping. That's just a different kind of going. He looked at her. For what it's worth, she added, quieter, from where I'm sitting, which is admittedly a kitchen that's partly open to the elements after a structural failure, this looks like considerably more than nothing. Lily looked up from her pasta dam. What are you talking about? Your dad, Victoria said. What about him? I was telling him he's done a good job. Lily looked at her father with the evaluating expression of someone whose opinion on this matter was well-formed and required no outside input. Yeah, she said, as if the matter were obvious and slightly boring. I know. Then she went back to her dam. Nathan looked at his soup. He didn't trust himself to say anything, so he didn't. But something in his chest had shifted slightly. The same way a joint shifts when something that's been locked wrong for a long time finally releases. By late afternoon, the snow was coming down straight and heavy, and the wind had dropped almost entirely, which confirmed his read on the storm cycle. They were through the worst of it. The temperature outside was still brutal, probably -15 with wind chill gone and bare air temp in the low single digits. But the structure of the event had changed from assault to aftermath. He went out twice to check the generator and the woodpile, and both times when he came back in, Victoria had something ready for him. First a mug of hot water because the coffee was gone, then a dry pair of gloves because his outer pair was soaked through. He hadn't asked for either thing. He wasn't sure what to do with being looked after, exactly. It wasn't something he'd had practice with in 4 years. You don't have to do that, he said, after the gloves. She looked at him. I know. I'm fine. I know you're fine, she said. I was being useful because I needed something to do, not because I thought you needed managing. He took the gloves. Fair enough. You have a problem accepting help. I have a realistic assessment of when help is necessary. Those two things are not the same thing. He put the gloves on. They were his good pair, the insulated work gloves he kept for the worst conditions, and he hadn't realized she'd found them in his coat closet. How'd you know which ones were the good ones? The others have duct tape on 2 fingers. He almost smiled. Those are working gloves. These are also working gloves. These are working gloves that work. You're very confident for someone who spent most of yesterday horizontal. I recover quickly. She said it without vanity, just as a statement of fact. It's possibly my worst quality. I bounce back so fast from things that I never actually process them. I just move on, and the thing I didn't process joins a pile that I also never process. And eventually the pile is very large. He looked at her. How large is your pile? She thought about it. Large enough that 2 days trapped in a half-collapsed cabin with a single father and a 7-year-old has genuinely felt like relief. It was honest enough that it landed without softening, and he stood with it for a moment. That's a complicated thing to feel. Most true things are. Lily appeared from the hallway at that point, carrying Captain Biscuit and her drawing pad, and inserted herself between them in the physical way of children who have no concept of conversational interruption. She held up the drawing pad. On it was a careful, detailed rendering of the cabin, the whole cabin, before the collapse, with the porch and the woodpile and 2 figures outside that were clearly meant to be her and Nathan. She'd spent the afternoon on it. In the corner, she'd added a 3rd figure, smaller than Nathan, taller than Lily, standing slightly apart but clearly part of the scene. Who's that? Nathan asked, though he thought he knew. Lily looked at the drawing, then at Victoria, then back. It's just someone who was there, she said, with the particular nonchalance of a 7-year-old who has made a decision and doesn't intend to explain it. She tucked the drawing pad under her arm and walked back to the bedroom. Nathan looked at the empty hallway where his daughter had been. He looked at Victoria. She was looking at the hallway too, and whatever was on her face in that moment she didn't bother to cover. He'd seen Victoria Ashcroft be controlled and composed and dry, and occasionally even funny, and he'd seen the seams in all of that. But this was different. This was something underneath the seams, something that had gotten through a gap that she hadn't protected because she hadn't known it was there. She looked away first. "She shouldn't have done that," Victoria said, her voice carefully even. "The drawing. It puts me in something I'm not—" "She doesn't do things she doesn't mean," Nathan said. "She's 7, not strategic." Victoria was quiet. "You don't have to make anything out of it," he said. "It's a drawing. It's a kid deciding something for herself." He paused. "But Lily doesn't include people in her cabin drawings. She's done a dozen of them. It's usually just her and me." He left it there. Didn't build on it. Didn't explain it further. Just left it as information in the space between them and let her do whatever she needed to do with it. The evening came down fast the way winter evenings in the mountains do. Not gradually, not with any warning, the light just suddenly passed and the dark already fully installed. Nathan got the lantern going and they moved back to the bedroom for the night. The three of them, with the kitchen door pulled shut to hold in what heat the wood stove had built up. They'd fallen into a shape, the three of them, without discussing it. Lily in the middle, adults on either side, the wool blankets arranged by now into a system. Lily fell asleep faster than the night before. The day had worn her out, or maybe she simply trusted the configuration more than she had 24 hours ago. Nathan lay in the dark and listened to his daughter's breathing and the faraway sound of wind that no longer had violence in it, and thought about a drawing with 3 figures and someone who was always running and a pile that had gotten very large. "Nathan." Victoria's voice, barely above a whisper, so as not to wake Lily. "Yeah." "When did it start getting better?" "After Claire." He thought about it seriously because the question deserved a serious answer. "I don't know if there was a when," he said, keeping his voice low. "It was more like, one day I realized the bad hours were fewer than they'd been. And then one day I realized whole days had passed that were okay. Not good necessarily, just okay. And okay started to feel like enough." "How long did that take?" 2 years before okay was regular, maybe 3, before I stopped waiting for it to go back to bad." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm still waiting for bad," she said. 3 years out, and I'm still braced." "I know." He shifted slightly. "You might be bracing so hard you can't tell the difference anymore between the brace and the thing you're bracing against." Lily turned in her sleep and her hand found Victoria's arm and rested there, small and warm and completely unconscious. "She does that too," Nathan said. "I know." A pause. "I don't mind." "I know you don't." The wind outside had settled to almost nothing. In the silence that was left, Nathan could hear the wood stove ticking as it cooled slightly, and Lily's even breathing, and somewhere further off, the sound of snow releasing from a pine branch and dropping. He didn't know what was going to happen when the roads cleared. He didn't know what happened between a man who had stopped expecting things and a woman who had spent 3 years expecting nothing but work. He didn't know if any of this, these 2 days of stripped-down, emergency-adjacent honesty, would translate into anything once the outside world reasserted itself and put them both back in the spaces they usually occupied. He just knew that outside the storm was finally letting go, and inside, for the first time in a long time, it was quiet enough to hear himself think. He was wrong about 12 hours. The break came faster than he'd predicted. Sometime in the early morning of the 3rd day, the snow simply stopped. Not gradually, not with any theatrical winding down. It just stopped, the way a held breath gets released, and what replaced it was a silence so complete and so absolute that Nathan woke from it the way you wake from a sound rather than into one. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the nothing. Then he got up carefully, moving so as not to disturb Lily or Victoria, and went to the bedroom window and scraped the frost from a corner of the glass with his thumbnail and looked out. The sky was clear. Not clearing, clear. A hard, black, fully committed clarity with stars in it that had no business being that sharp, the kind of sky that only existed after a major weather system had scoured everything soft out of the atmosphere. The snow on the ground glittered under it like something expensive. The pines along the east ridge were loaded white and absolutely motionless. He stood there for a while looking at it. There was something about the aftermath of a bad storm that he'd never been able to adequately explain to people who hadn't lived in the mountains. It wasn't relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was more like the world had been put through something and come out the other side changed, and the change was neutral, not better, not worse, just different in ways that were going to take some time to fully account for. The mountain didn't apologize for the blizzard. It just presented you with the morning after and expected you to work with it. He went to get the wood stove going again. Victoria found him in the kitchen 20 minutes later, already in his coat and boots, the fire up, and a pot of water heating on the burner. She was wrapped in the wool blanket still, her feet in his wool socks, hair that had gone 3 days without anything approaching proper attention, and she looked, not bad exactly, but genuinely unconstructed in a way he suspected very few people had seen her. She went to the window first thing, looked out, stood there. "It stopped," she said. "Yeah. When?" "Few hours ago, I think. I woke up to the quiet." She turned from the window. Her eyes were clear and alert in the way of someone who'd actually slept, maybe for the first time properly since this started. The bruise on her temple had shifted color again overnight, moving now from the purple-red phase into the greenish-yellow of healing, still visible but no longer alarming. "What does this mean for getting out?" she asked. "Road crews will have started as soon as it stopped. County protocol is to hit the main routes first. Route 7, the highway connector down to Cedar Falls. If they're running through the night, the main road could be passable by this afternoon." He poured hot water into 2 mugs, added the last of the instant coffee. "The service road up to here is secondary. Could be another day, could be tomorrow morning." She took the mug. "So we wait." "We wait." She sat down at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. Outside, the sky was doing the slow work of becoming dawn, the black softening at the eastern edges to something dark blue, and then dark blue going to gray, and the gray beginning to show the detail of the landscape in it, like a photograph developing. "I need to find a way to signal that we're here," he said. "My truck has a radio, but the antenna took some damage. I tried it yesterday and got nothing useful. If I can get up to the service road junction, there's higher ground. Better line of sight to the relay." "How far is the junction?" "Half-mile up through the trees, maybe 40 minutes in this snow depth." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "I'm going with you." "Your boots aren't rated for this cold." "I'll use whatever you have." "Victoria, I'm not sitting in a damaged cabin alone," she said, without heat but with complete finality. "Not because I can't handle it. Because if something happens to you out there, Lily is alone and I have no way to help, and that's not acceptable." He looked at her. She looked back. The logic was airtight, and they both knew it. "I have an old pair of pack boots in the closet that might fit you," he said finally. "They're too big. I'll use extra socks." He found the boots. She wore 3 pairs of socks with them, and they were still half a size too large, but she laced them tight and stood up and didn't complain. He gave her his spare balaclava and his second warmest coat, which was a down hunting jacket from 6 winters ago that came down to her mid-thigh and had a broken zipper at the collar that he'd been meaning to fix. She zipped it as far as it would go and looked at him. "I look ridiculous." "You look warm," he said. "Which is the goal." Lily woke while they were preparing, emerging from the bedroom with Captain Biscuit and the focused, slightly accusatory expression of a child who suspects something is happening without her. Nathan explained the plan in simple terms. He and Victoria were going to hike up to the road junction to try the radio. She was going to stay inside and keep warm. The fire was going. There was bread and peanut butter on the counter. "What if I get scared?" Lily asked. "Count things," he said. It was what he'd always told her. When she was anxious or scared, he'd taught her to count the things she could see, hear, touch. A grounding exercise Claire had read about somewhere and passed on to him before she died. "Count the books on the shelf, count the knots in the floorboards. I'll be back before you get bored." "I don't get bored," Lily said with the mild offense of someone whose inner life was evidently quite sufficient. "I know, that's why I'm not worried." Victoria had crouched down in front of Lily. She was at eye level with his daughter, which, given the height difference, required some genuine crouching, and she held Lily's gaze with a directness that didn't condescend. "We'll be back in a couple hours," she said, "and I'll bring Captain Biscuit something." Lily considered this. "What?" "What does he need?" A pause of genuine deliberation. "He's been cold," Lily said. "He could use a pine cone." "Done." Lily looked at her for another second, and then turned and went back to the bedroom. Nathan looked at Victoria. She stood back up and brushed pine debris off the knees of her borrowed leggings, and didn't say anything about the exchange, which he was beginning to understand was her way. Not to mark moments, just to move through them. They went out the back door. The cold was extraordinary. Not the violent, moving cold of the storm, but the still, crystalline cold of high-altitude winter morning post-storm, the kind that was quiet and brilliant and absolutely impartial about whether you could survive in it. Nathan felt it close around him immediately. The exposed parts of his face, his eyes, the small gap between his collar and his balaclava, like something pressing in at every seal. The snow depth was significant. In the open areas, it was thigh-deep on him, which meant it was going to be worse for Victoria, who was 3 inches shorter. He went first, breaking trail, and she followed in his tracks with a steady, slightly labored efficiency that didn't complain and didn't quit. The trees helped. Under the pines, the snow was shallower, wind-scoured and compacted, and they made better time in the tree line than in the open. Nathan found the old game trail he'd used 1,000 times and followed it by memory. The curve of the ridge, the particular stand of aspens that leaned east from decades of prevailing wind, the flat granite shelf that stuck out of the hillside like a shelf put there on purpose. They didn't talk much on the way up. The effort required for the altitude and the snow depth and the cold made extended conversation impractical, and he'd found over the past 2 days that Victoria was comfortable with silence in a way that wasn't common. Most people filled silence out of social reflex. She seemed to actually use it. They reached the junction after 50 minutes, which was longer than he'd estimated. The higher ground opened out from the trees into a broad, wind-scoured clearing where the service road met the secondary track from the ridge, and from this elevation he could see down into the valley, the gray thread of Route 7 through the white, and on it, distantly but unmistakably, the yellow flicker of road maintenance equipment. "They're on Route 7, he said. Victoria was breathing hard from the climb. She stood beside him and looked down at the valley. "How long until they get to the service road?" "If they're working a full crew, maybe 6 hours. 8. Depends on how many blowovers they're dealing with on the main route first." He pulled out the truck's portable radio unit he'd grabbed from the cab before they left. A handheld, rated to 5 miles in clear conditions. He clicked it on and found the county maintenance frequency and keyed the mic. "County Dispatch, this is Nathan Hale, road crew employee stranded at Service Road Mile Marker 3, north of Route 7 Junction. Over." Static. He waited. Tried again. This time, after a delay that went long enough to make him think it wasn't going to work, a voice came back, "Barshi." Scratchy, broken up by distance and residual atmospheric interference, but identifiable as human and as dispatch. "Nathan, copy that. Good to hear you. We've been looking. Search and rescue has a report open on your truck. You okay up there? Over. 3 people, 1 injured, non-critical. Cabin partially collapsed from snow load, structurally compromised north section. We've got heat, food, we're not in immediate danger. How long to the service road? Over." A pause while someone checked something. "Service road is scheduled for tomorrow morning early. We can try to bump it up if—" "Don't bump it," he said. "Tomorrow morning is fine. We're stable. Just wanted you to know we're here. Over." "Copy that." "You sure? Because we have a SAR team that could potentially—" "Tomorrow is fine," he said again. "We're good. Over." He signed off. Victoria was looking at him. He noticed she hadn't interrupted, hadn't tried to take the radio, hadn't suggested he modify his answer. She'd let him make the call. "Tomorrow," she said. "We're fine until tomorrow." "I know." She turned to look at the valley again. Below them, the equipment moved along Route 7 in its slow, methodical way. "I wasn't arguing." "I know you weren't." He put the radio back in his coat pocket. "If I'd said we needed SAR now, they'd have sent someone and it would have taken resources from people who actually needed emergency extraction. We don't. We have food and fire and a structurally sound back half of a cabin." "You made the right call." "I usually do," he said, and it came out without any particular pride, just a flat, familiar knowledge of his own capabilities in this landscape. She looked at him with that evaluating quality she sometimes had. That's the most straightforwardly confident thing I've heard you say about yourself. I know this mountain, he said simply. I don't know much else, but I know this. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite what he'd call admiration. Something less simple than that. A kind of recalibration. She turned back to the view, and he let her look at it. The morning was extraordinary from up here. The entire valley spread out below them in white and gray, and the cold blue shadow of the ridgeline, and the sky above was that hard-scoured alpine blue that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Route 7 thread and its tiny yellow machines, the dark smudge of Cedar Falls to the west, the way the light was hitting the eastern slopes and making the snow surface look like it was lit from underneath. It's beautiful, Victoria said. She said it simply, without the slight self-consciousness people sometimes had about saying obvious things. Yeah, he'd seen it 1,000 times, and it still did something to him he didn't have a word for. Gets worse the longer you're away from it. Have you been away? 3 years, Denver. He looked at the ridgeline. I thought I was going somewhere, but I was just going somewhere that wasn't here, which is a different thing. And you came back. My dad needed me. And then I was back, and it turned out I'd needed to be back for longer than my dad had needed me. He paused. Claire was from here, too. She was one of the reasons staying made sense. And now? He considered the question. Now Lily is enough reason on its own. A pause. There are days that's a very light thing to carry, and days it's the heaviest thing there is. Same fact, different days. She didn't offer anything to smooth that over, which was exactly right. She just stood with it, and it occurred to him not for the first time that Victoria Ashcroft's particular skill, underneath the business acumen, underneath the armor, might simply be that she could be present for hard things without needing to fix them. He found her the pine cone on the way back down. It was sitting on the granite shelf like it had been placed there, large and symmetrical, still closed tight from the cold. He picked it up and held it out. She looked at it. You remembered. I said I'd bring one. You said I'd bring one. Same thing. She took it and tucked it in the pocket of the hunting jacket without ceremony, and they continued down through the trees. Getting back was easier than going out. They had a broken trail to follow, and the sun was fully up now, cutting across the snow surface and lifting the temperature by a handful of precious degrees. By the time the cabin came into view through the last stand of pines, Nathan's feet had warmed back to something functional, and the worst of the deep cold had backed off into a merely uncomfortable cold. Lily was at the kitchen window when they came into the yard. He could see her small face watching them through the glass, and when she saw him, she disappeared from the window, and by the time they'd stomped the snow off their boots on the porch and come in through the back door. She was standing in the kitchen with Captain Biscuit and an expression of careful nonchalance that didn't quite conceal the relief under it. You took longer than you said, she told him. Snow was deep. You said 2 hours. I said a couple hours. Couple is flexible. She looked at Victoria. Victoria produced the pine cone from her coat pocket and held it out. Lily took it with both hands and studied it with the same seriousness she applied to everything. It's a good one, she said. I thought so. Lily handed it to Captain Biscuit, who was made to hold it with some creative positioning of his faded paws. Did you fix the radio? I talked to someone, Nathan said, hanging up the borrowed coat. Help is coming tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Lily processed this. So we sleep here one more time. One more time. She nodded, accepting it. Then she went and put the pine cone on the kitchen windowsill instead of giving it to the rabbit after all, which he suspected was what she'd intended from the start, and she climbed into her chair at the table and resumed whatever imaginative project she'd been running in their absence. The day that followed was the strangest of the three in ways Nathan found difficult to account for. The emergency was technically over. They were stable. They had a timeline. Help was coming. The crisis had resolved into waiting, and waiting, it turned out, produced a particular quality of time that the crisis had not, slower and fuller, and somehow both easier and harder than the acute difficulty of the days before. He worked on what he could of the cabin's damaged section. He couldn't do structural work without materials he didn't have, But he could clear debris from the kitchen boundary, could shore up the temporary barrier between the collapsed section and the habitable space, could assess what would be needed when he was able to do proper repairs. He worked methodically and without hurry. Victoria helped with the parts that required two people and left him alone with the parts that didn't, which was another version of the same quality he'd identified earlier, a practical intelligence about when presence was useful and when it wasn't. Lily drew. She'd filled most of her drawing pad by now. Horses, the cabin, a detailed rendering of Captain Biscuit from multiple angles that showed more technical skill than most 7-year-olds Nathan knew. At one point in the afternoon, she turned to a fresh page and drew for a long time with unusual concentration. And when Nathan passed behind her, he glanced down and saw she was drawing people. 3 figures, but different from the cabin drawing. These were sitting at a table, recognizable if you knew what you were looking at. He didn't say anything. He went and got another piece of wood for the stove. Victoria saw the drawing sometime later. He knew because she went quiet in a particular way. And when he looked across the kitchen, she was standing behind Lily's chair with an expression on her face that she was working hard to keep neutral and not quite succeeding at. She saw him watching and turned away, and he turned away too, and they both pretended they hadn't seen each other seeing anything. In the afternoon, Lily fell asleep in the chair at the table, head on her arms, Captain Biscuit tucked against her side, and Nathan carried her to the bedroom and came back to find Victoria standing at the kitchen window looking out at the afternoon light on the snow. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can always ask. What happens when you get back?" She didn't answer right away. She kept looking at the window. "My CFO will have a list of things that have been waiting. My legal team will want to go over the filing. My board has been expecting a strategic review that I've been postponing for 6 weeks." A pause. "My apartment will be the same temperature I left it." "That's what happens at work," he said. "I asked what happens when you get back." She turned from the window. She looked at him with that unguarded quality she'd developed over the course of these days. Not the initial armored stillness she'd had when she'd first woken up on his couch, but something with more surface area, more reachable. "I don't know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." And I'm not sure the life I'm going back to is the life I want to keep having." She said it plainly, without drama. "I've been building something for 5 years that I thought I wanted, and I'm not certain anymore who I was building it for." Daniel would have had very clear opinions about this. He would have said something obnoxious and accurate that I'd have argued with for a week before admitting he was right. "What do you think he'd say?" She looked at the pine cone on the windowsill. "He'd say that success is not the same thing as a life. He used to say that when I was coming up, back when I was working 18-hour days and calling it ambition, he'd say, 'Vicky, you can have everything you're aiming for and wake up one day in an empty room.'" She paused. 3 years later, I keep waking up in an empty room, wondering when I got here." Nathan sat down at the table. The kitchen was warm, the fire having done solid work through the day, and the afternoon light was coming through the west-facing window at a low angle that turned everything amber. He thought about empty rooms. He thought about how a room could be full of a person's things and still have an absence in it that took up space. "After Claire died," he said, "I couldn't sleep in our bedroom for 8 months. I slept on that couch that's now under a ton of snow. And I knew it was avoidance. I knew the bedroom was still just a bedroom. She wasn't in it. Avoiding it was irrational. But I couldn't make myself do it anyway." "What changed?" "Lily." He folded his hands on the table. "She was going through a phase of being scared of her room at night, maybe 3.5 years old. And she needed me in there with her. And it was across the hall from our room. And one night I went in to check on her and I stopped in the doorway of our room on the way back. And I stood there long enough that I stopped being able to leave. And then I sat on the bed. And then I lay down." He looked at his hands, and nothing happened. It was just a room. And I felt so stupid and so grateful at the same time that it was just a room. Victoria was sitting across from him now. He wasn't sure when she'd sat down. "The things we make ourselves not go near," she said quietly. "Yeah. I've done that with a lot. His things. The farm where we grew up, the restaurant in Boston where we always had dinner when I was in the city." She looked at the table. I haven't been to Boston in 2 years, which is insane. There's no logical reason I can't go to Boston. Grief's not logical. No. She was quiet for a moment. My mother called it keeping the hurt safe, like you're protecting the wound instead of healing it. She's a very practical woman, my mother. She would have liked this cabin. He looked at her. Would she like you sitting in a partially collapsed version of it in a broken zippered hunting jacket? The corner of her mouth moved. She'd say the jacket builds character. She sounds smart. She is. I don't call her enough. It came out with a particular flat honesty, not performative guilt, just a fact she was aware of. He thought about his own mother in Denver and the phone calls he kept meaning to make in the weeks that became months, and the way you could let important things slide in the machinery of getting through days. I don't call my mother enough either, he said. We're a pair, she said, without irony. We are, he said, and it came out with a slight undercurrent he hadn't entirely planned, and they both heard it, and the kitchen went quiet in the specific way that happened when something true had been said, and there was no taking it back and no real desire to. She looked at him directly. She had that quality of absolute attention when she chose to give it, a quality that probably made her very effective in rooms full of people trying to negotiate, because it made you feel both seen and accountable. What happens when I leave? She asked. And it was a different version of the question he'd asked her, not about professional logistics, not about going back, but about the specific thing that was sitting between them in the kitchen without either of them having named it. He thought about what he was going to say before he said it, which wasn't usually how he operated, but seemed right here. I don't know, he said finally. I haven't thought about what happens with anyone in a long time. Neither have I. That's not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. But I also don't do things halfway, he said. I don't know how. I tried once, after Claire, this woman in town, Linda Carr, very nice, nothing wrong with her, and I couldn't do it because I kept knowing that I wasn't actually there, that I was just going through motions. He paused. I'm not interested in motions. I'm not either, she said. I know. So. He looked at her. I think when you leave, you leave. And what we do with that is something neither of us knows yet, and rushing it would wreck it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the way she'd nodded at the breakfast agenda on the first morning, crisply, with the air of someone accepting a term that was reasonable. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. Outside, the sky was doing its mountain evening work, the blue pulling out of it, the cold coming back down off the peaks, the first stars visible at the eastern edge. Inside, the wood stove was warm and the amber light was thick, and somewhere down the hall Lily was asleep with her rabbit and her pine cone. He should have been tired. He was tired, physically, in every muscle and in a bone-deep way that 3 nights of limited, interrupted sleep produced. But he was also, underneath that, more alert than he'd felt in years. The particular alertness of someone who's been living in a kind of low-grade numbness for so long that the lifting of it registers almost like pain. He started making dinner. Victoria got up without being asked and found the things he'd been reaching for before he reached for them. And they worked in the kitchen again with the same slightly imprecise but gradually improving choreography they'd developed, and neither of them talked much, and the talking they did was practical and small and easy. At some point Lily appeared, Captain Biscuit in hand, announcing she was hungry, and she climbed into her chair and watched them cook with the alert, proprietary satisfaction of someone watching their own domain being properly tended. You're getting better at that, she told them. At cooking? Nathan said. At being in the same kitchen. She said it as a simple observation, the way she'd said he was good at helping. Victoria set down the spoon she'd been using. Are we? You're not bumping anymore, Lily confirmed, and Victoria got the right cabinet the first time. I've been paying attention, Victoria said. It shows, Lily said with the gravity of a restaurant critic delivering a verdict. Nathan put the food on the table and they sat down and ate, and the wind outside was light and the fire was steady, and his daughter talked about horses and Captain Biscuit's structural engineering education and whether pine cones opened when it got warm. They did, he told her. That was how the seeds got out. and Victoria said she hadn't known that, which was possibly true and was definitely generous, and Lily received this information about her own superior knowledge with quiet satisfaction. He washed the dishes after. Victoria dried. Lily was back in the bedroom, and the kitchen was quiet with just the two of them and the small sounds of the work, and Nathan was aware, in a way that was new, of the proximity. 2 feet of kitchen, 2 people who knew more about each other than most people learned in months of ordinary acquaintance. He was aware of it the way you're aware of something you've been not thinking about for days, and now that the not thinking had become thinking, you couldn't put it back. He handed her the last bowl. Their hands were close for a moment. Neither of them said anything. She dried the bowl and put it on the shelf and folded the dish towel over the stove handle and turned to say something. He thought she was going to say something. And then from the bedroom hallway came Lily's voice. "Can someone come? I don't want to sleep alone tonight." They both looked toward the hallway. "One more night," Nathan said quietly. Victoria picked up the lantern from the counter. "Come on then," she said, and she went down the hallway, and after a moment he followed. The 3 of them arranged themselves the same way they had the 2 nights before, and Lily settled between them with the unself-conscious ease of a child who had already decided this was simply how things were, and the lantern went low, and the storm was gone, and only the silence was left, which was better than the storm, and harder in its own way. Nathan lay in the dark and listened to his daughter's breathing even out. And then, slowly, Victoria's. He stayed awake long after both of them were asleep. He lay there thinking about what he'd said. "I don't do things halfway." And how true it was, and how much it had cost him, and how for 4 years halfway would have been generous as a description of how much of himself he'd actually brought to anything that wasn't Lily or the mountain. He thought about Claire and how she would have had opinions about this. Precise, probably loud opinions that she'd have delivered at high volume over dinner and then walked back to something more nuanced by bedtime. She'd have liked Victoria, he thought. She'd have found her interesting, which was Claire's highest compliment, and she'd have had no patience for the armor, which she'd have punctured without even trying, because Claire had never understood armor as a concept. He thought about a woman with a very large pile and an empty apartment and a mother she didn't call enough. He thought about tomorrow. He looked at the ceiling of the back bedroom, the one ceiling in the cabin that had held, that was still solid and intact above them. And he thought, the cabin can be fixed. The bones are good. Everything's fixable if you're not trying to put it back exactly the way it was. He'd said that about the cabin. He wasn't entirely sure, lying there in the last night of the storm's aftermath, that he'd only been talking about the cabin. At some point before dawn, Lily shifted in her sleep, and her hand found his arm the way it always did, and held on. And on the other side of her, Victoria was still and breathing, and the cold outside was a simple cold now, not a killing cold, just the ordinary cold of a Colorado mountain February that anyone could handle with proper gear and a decent fire. Tomorrow would come. The road crews would come. And everything that came with tomorrow was going to require something of him that he hadn't been asked for in a long time. He wasn't sure he was ready. He was fairly sure being ready wasn't required. He'd never been ready for any of the things that had mattered. He closed his eyes, and this time sleep actually came. And it was the best sleep he'd gotten in 3 days. The road crew arrived at 8:47 in the morning. Nathan heard them before he saw them. The low diesel grind of a plow working up the service road, that particular mechanical persistence that he knew from the inside, from the driver's seat, from 1,000 winter mornings in the cab. He was already in the kitchen when the sound reached him, and he stood with his coffee and listened to it getting closer and felt something complicated happening in his chest that he didn't immediately try to name. Lily heard it too. She came out of the bedroom at a run, Captain Biscuit bouncing in her grip, and went straight to the kitchen window and pressed her face against the glass. "Is that them?" "That's them." "Are they coming all the way up?" "Close enough. They'll clear to the junction and we'll walk out to meet them." She turned from the window. There was something in her face that he hadn't expected, not pure relief, which was what he'd anticipated, but something more mixed than that. She looked at the kitchen, at the wood stove, at the table where they'd eaten 3 days of meals. She looked like someone who was doing the same thing she'd done after Claire died, the same quiet archiving, memorizing the configuration of things before they changed. "Lily," he said. She looked at him. It's okay?" She nodded, but the nod was slower than usual. Victoria appeared from the hallway, already dressed, or as dressed as she'd been able to manage with the limited resources available, his flannel shirt layered under the hunting jacket, her own travel pants that had dried overnight, the Pax boots with their 3 pairs of socks. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found in the kitchen junk drawer. She'd borrowed his toothbrush the night before, after asking with the slight formality of someone for whom borrowing was not a natural mode, and he'd said yes without making anything of it. And now she stood in the kitchen doorway looking composed in the particular way of someone who had figured out how to be composed in circumstances that hadn't given them many tools to work with. "I heard," she said. 20 minutes, maybe. I need to pack up what we're carrying out." She was already moving before he finished the sentence, going to the back bedroom to collect the things that had accumulated there over 3 days. He heard the quiet efficiency of her working, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment doing nothing, which was unlike him, but the moment seemed to call for it. He looked at the wood stove. He looked at the table with its 4 chairs and its 2 occupied settings from breakfast. He looked at the window where the pine cone was still sitting on the sill, the one Victoria had collected from the ridge. He picked it up and put it in his coat pocket. The walk out to the service road junction was different from the walk up to the ridge the day before. The snow was the same depth, the cold was similar, the trees were the same trees, but the quality of the journey had changed because the direction had changed. Going out was not the same as going up. Going out meant the storm chapter was ending, and whatever came next had not yet announced itself clearly, and the space between those 2 things was uncomfortable in a way that neither the storm itself nor its immediate aftermath had been. Lily walked between them on the trail he'd broken. She held Captain Biscuit in the crook of her arm, and she was quiet in a way she hadn't been much over the past 3 days. He watched her from behind and noted the set of her small shoulders. Not upset, not frightened, but processing. She was very like her mother in this, the internal processor, running everything through before letting it out. Victoria was on Lily's left side, and he noticed she shortened her stride to match Lily's pace without drawing attention to doing it. He noticed a lot of things about Victoria that he'd stopped noticing deliberately, because deliberately noticing had started to feel like it was edging into territory he told himself to leave alone until after everything was less immediate. He noticed anyway. The plow was parked at the junction, engine running, and the driver was a man named Carol Briggs, who Nathan had worked alongside for 6 winters, and who was now standing in the cleared roadway, stamping his feet against the cold and looking relieved in the uncomplicated way of someone who'd been sent to find people and had found them. "Nathan!" Carol shook his hand hard, the grip of someone who'd been genuinely worried. "You look like hell." "Thanks, Carol. We got your radio call yesterday. Dispatch said you were stable." He looked at Victoria, then at Lily, then back at Nathan with the calibrated discretion of a man who understood that questions about the specifics of how a single father had ended up stranded with an unknown woman were questions for a later context. "We've got a second vehicle coming up behind me, County SAR. They're bringing the medic." "We don't need the medic," Nathan started. "She decides that," Carol said, nodding toward Victoria. "Not you." Victoria looked at Carol with an expression that was close to approving. "He's right," she told Nathan. "I'll see the medic." Nathan opened his mouth, reconsidered, and closed it. "Fine." The SAR vehicle arrived 12 minutes later, a county 4x4 with an EMT named Rosa Medina, who had the businesslike warmth of someone who'd pulled people out of bad situations enough times that she'd learned how to make it feel routine without making people feel minimized. She checked Victoria thoroughly, the head wound, her temperature, reflexes, vision, and she checked Lily, and she looked at Nathan and said, "You need anything?" "I'm good." She looked at him the way medical people looked at you when they'd decided you were the type who'd say you were good, regardless of whether you were. "Sit down for a minute." "Rosa, sit." He sat on the running board of the SAR vehicle and let her check his hands, which had taken more cold exposure than he'd fully accounted for, and his face, and she shone a light in his eyes and asked him a few questions. "You're fine," she said finally. "But your second and third fingers on the right hand had some frostnip. Keep them warm." "I know what frostnip is." "Then act like it." She packed up her kit. "The woman, is she insured?" "I have no idea." Rosa glanced toward where Victoria was standing with Carol and Lily, out of earshot. Who is she? Someone who went off Route 7. Rosa absorbed this with professional neutrality. She needs follow-up. That head wound was deeper than it looks healed, and she ran her core temperature down pretty significantly. She should see a doctor in Cedar Falls today. I'll tell her. She looks like someone who'll tell you she's fine. She will. Then tell her firmly. He found Victoria after Rosa had moved off to complete her paperwork, and he delivered the instruction with the directness it required. You're going to Cedar Falls to see a doctor today. Not tomorrow. Today. She looked at him. I was going to anyway. Good. I'm not actually difficult, she said, and there was something slightly wry in it. You're difficult, he said, without heat. You're also practical enough to override it when it matters. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a moment. You've figured me out fairly quickly. I've had 3 days with limited distractions. Carol was running the plow back down to a turnaround spot, and the SAR vehicle was going to take Victoria and Lily down to the highway where a county van would meet them. Nathan was staying. He needed to secure what could be secured of the cabin before he left, make sure the wood stove was properly banked, and the structure was as stable as it was going to be, assess the damage properly in daylight. It was going to take several hours, possibly the full day. He'd told Carol he'd drive his own truck down when he was done, once the road was clear enough. This was the part he'd known was coming, the part where the thing that had been a sealed environment for 3 days cracked open and let the outside back in, and the outside would reassert its usual distances and its usual categories, and the particular intimacy of emergency would need to find a different shape or no shape at all. Lily understood they were separating before he'd explained it. She'd always been like that, reading the situation before the situation announced itself. She came to him while Victoria was talking to Rosa about the follow-up appointment, and she pressed herself against his side with the quiet insistence of someone staking a claim. You're not coming, she said. I'll be there tonight. Few hours. She was quiet. Lily, I know, she said. You have to fix things. The cabin needs... I know, Daddy. She looked up at him. Her eyes were very much Claire's eyes. That particular shade of gray-brown that changed in different light, serious and watchful. I'm not upset. You seem a little upset. I'm thinking. About what? She looked across the cleared road to where Victoria was now standing alone, looking at her phone, which had apparently found a signal at the lower elevation, with an expression that was doing several things Nathan couldn't fully read from a distance. Is she coming back? Lily asked. He looked at his daughter. I don't know. But maybe? Maybe, he said. Yeah, maybe. Lily considered this with the methodical seriousness she applied to things that mattered. Then she nodded, apparently having reached a conclusion, and went and stood next to Victoria without any further discussion. He watched his daughter stand beside this woman in the cleared road in the mountain morning, both of them looking at the phone screen, Victoria pointing at something and saying something he couldn't hear, Lily responding with an expression of intense interest. He watched it long enough to know he was doing it, and kept watching anyway. Carol came back with the plow. Road's clear to the highway from here. Your truck should make it fine. Thanks, Carol. Cabin looks rough from here. It is. Repairable, but rough. Carol looked at it, the professional assessment of a man who'd seen mountain structures in all states of weather damage. North Pitch always was too shallow. Your grandfather built it for looks on that side. I know. I should have dealt with it 2 winters ago. Well? Carol shrugged, the philosophical shrug of someone who understood that maintenance lists always had things at the bottom that stayed at the bottom until they didn't. You'll deal with it now. Yeah. They shook hands again, and Carol climbed back into the plow, and Nathan turned back to the SAR vehicle where Rosa was finishing up and where Lily was now apparently showing Victoria something in her drawing pad, because the pad had materialized from somewhere, and Victoria was looking at it with genuine attention. He walked over. This is the ridge where Daddy and Victoria went to fix the radio, Lily was explaining, pointing to a drawing he hadn't seen before. She'd apparently added a new page that morning. 2 figures on a slope, pines around them, a clearing at the top. And this is where they found the pine cone. Victoria looked up when he arrived. She looked at him, and then at the drawing and back at him. She captured it, she said. She captures everything. Lily turned the pad around to show him. The drawing was good. Better than good for a 7-year-old, with a real sense of the terrain and the scale of the figures against the trees. She'd put detail into the clearing at the top, the open sky, the valley below. He recognized the granite shelf. "That's a good drawing, Bug." "I know." She tucked the pad under her arm. "Can I take it in the car?" "Yeah, don't lose it." Rosa indicated it was time. Lily climbed into the SAR vehicle without much fuss, negotiating the high step up with Captain Biscuit under one arm and the drawing pad under the other. Nathan lifted her the last few inches, and she settled into the back seat and buckled herself with the focused competence she'd developed about seatbelts, which was one of the things he'd drilled so hard it had become automatic. He stepped back from the vehicle. Victoria was standing a few feet away. She had her phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at him with that quality of full attention he'd come to recognize, the one that made you feel both seen and slightly accountable. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did on Route 7. "You already thanked me." "I thanked you when I had hypothermia and had just woken up in a stranger's cabin. I don't think that fully counted." He looked at her. The morning light was strong up here, and it showed everything. The bruise, the 3 days of limited sleep, the way she'd been carrying herself since the roof came down, upright and capable, and privately not entirely okay. He thought she looked more real than anyone he'd been this close to in a long time, and he wasn't sure if that was an objective observation or simply what happened when you'd seen someone at their actual edges. "You're welcome," he said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth more than you know." She paused. "I'm going to call my mother when I get signal." "Good. And I'm going to think seriously about some things." "I figured you would. I think about everything too seriously." "I know." He looked past her at the mountains, the ridge they'd climbed yesterday in the dark morning cold. "So do I." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Can I have your number?" It was such a simple, practical 21st century question that he almost laughed. After 3 days of the most stripped-down human exchange he'd had in 4 years, the ordinary mechanics of it, a phone number, a contact, felt both slightly absurd and completely necessary. He told her his number. She put it in her phone, thumbs moving with the automatic speed of someone who lived by the device. She looked up when she'd saved it. "I'm going to use it," she said. "I know. I want to be clear that I'm not saying it as a polite thing. I'm saying it as a Victoria." He said her name the way you say a name when you want someone to stop talking and just accept the thing. "I know." She stopped. She looked at him with something that was maybe relief and maybe something that didn't have a name yet. Rosa called from the driver's side that they needed to get moving. Victoria took a step toward the vehicle and then turned back. She reached into the pocket of the hunting jacket, the one she was still wearing, which she hadn't mentioned and he hadn't mentioned either, and she pulled out the pine cone from the ridge and held it out. He looked at it. "For the rebuilding," she said. "Put it somewhere in the new section. So something from this is in the structure." He took it. It sat in his palm, cold and closed and solid. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in his coat pocket next to where he'd put the one from the windowsill. He had both of them now. She got in the vehicle. He stepped back. Lily appeared at the rear window and pressed her hand flat against the glass, the wave of a child who'd seen it done in movies and found it appropriate to the occasion. He put his hand up in return, flat against the air, and held it there until the vehicle turned at the junction and went down the service road and disappeared into the trees. He stood in the cleared road by himself for a moment. Then he turned and went back to the cabin. The work kept him occupied for the next 6 hours, in the particular way that physical labor in a familiar landscape had always occupied him, completely, without gaps, the task filling the available mental space so fully that everything else had to wait its turn. He assessed the structural damage in proper daylight, which was both better and worse than he'd feared. Better because the south and east walls were fully intact and the kitchen support structure was solid. Worse because the north section was going to need a complete rebuild. New header beams, new roofing structure, Not a patch job, but a proper reconstruction. He photographed everything methodically for the insurance claim. He cleared what debris he safely could from the kitchen boundary and reinforced the temporary barrier with materials from the storage shed that had come through the storm untouched. He banked the wood stove correctly and shut the damper to the precise setting that would let it hold embers without risk. He covered the exposed section of the collapsed ceiling with 2 tarps from the shed, weighting the edges with sections of timber, knowing they wouldn't hold against another serious storm, but would give the interior some protection against the immediate elements. He worked without music, without the radio. The mountain was quiet after the storm in the way it got. The sound-absorbing depth of fresh snow, the bare branch stillness of the aspens, the occasional percussion of a snow load releasing from a pine. He worked in that quiet and let it be what it was. At some point in the early afternoon, he found himself in what remained of the front room, standing on the edge of the debris field, looking at where the couch had been. The leather corner was visible now, the debris having shifted slightly as it settled, and the top layer having been moved during his clearance work. He could see the dark brown edge of it, the familiar worn arm where he'd spent 8 months sleeping because he couldn't make himself go back to the bedroom. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went and found a shovel and he dug it out. It took 40 minutes, and by the end his back was telling him several things he chose to ignore. The couch was damaged, one leg broken, the seat cushion soaked through with snow melt, the leather cracked in several places across the back. It was probably not salvageable, not in any way that made practical sense. He dragged it to the cleared area outside the cabin door anyway. He'd figure out what to do with it when he could bring in a truck. He stood looking at it in the afternoon light. This piece of furniture that had been Claire's choice and his 8-month refuge and Lily's movie night spot, and the place where he'd first laid an unconscious woman he didn't know, and whose presence had rearranged something he'd thought was permanent. "Okay," he said to it out loud, because he was alone and the mountain didn't judge. "Okay." He went back inside and finished his work. He got to Cedar Falls at 4:15 in the afternoon, his truck finding the main highway with the relief of a vehicle that had spent 3 days making do with inadequate roads. Cedar Falls was not a large town. 1,200 people, a main street with a diner and a hardware store and a pharmacy, a school where Lily was in 2nd grade, a county services building, a small regional medical clinic. He knew every building and most of the people and had found the familiarity of it both comforting and occasionally suffocating for 4 years. He picked up Lily from the county family services waiting room where a woman named Denise, who he knew from the school pickup line, had been sitting with her. Lily had apparently conducted herself with complete equanimity and had drawn 3 more pictures in the waiting room and explained the structural failure of the cabin's north section to 2 different SAR administrative staff, who had not asked for this explanation, but had received it graciously. "She's something," Denise told him. "I know." Lily let him hug her at the door. A real hug, her arms going around his neck and holding on for a beat longer than her usual quick hugs. And then she stepped back and looked at him with Claire's assessing eyes. "Did you fix it?" "Started to. It's going to take longer. I'll need to hire a crew in the spring. Can we stay at Grandma Wilson's?" Claire's mother, who lived in Cedar Falls proper and who had been his primary backup for the past 4 years. "I called her from the truck. Yeah, a few weeks, maybe. She has better cereal than us. She has a lot of better things than us. Her bathtub is bigger. Lily. I'm just saying." He put her in the truck and drove to the clinic. He told himself he was just checking that Victoria had actually gone in, which was a reasoning that worked on its surface and didn't survive much examination. The clinic had 3 cars in its lot, one of which was a county vehicle and one of which was a rental. Because, of course, someone had arranged a rental from somewhere. Because that was apparently what happened when you had resources. He sat in the truck for a moment. "Are we going in?" Lily asked. "I was thinking about it." "We should go in," she said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had already decided. "She's probably in with the doctor. We can wait." He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with absolute patience. He got out of the truck. The clinic's waiting room was small. 6 chairs, a reception desk, a rack of pamphlets about flu prevention. Victoria was not in with the doctor. She was sitting in one of the waiting room chairs with her phone in her hand and her coat on, and she looked up when they came in with an expression that moved through several things very quickly before settling on something composed. "You're done," she said. "For today. You're still here. The doctor wants to run a blood panel. I've been waiting for the results." She looked at Lily. "Hi." "Hi." Lily climbed into the chair next to Victoria with the ease of someone who had established a comfort level with a person and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She settled Captain Biscuit on her lap. "Did the doctor look at your head?" "She did." "What did she say?" "That it's healing fine." "I said that this morning," Lily pointed out. "You were right." Victoria looked at Lily with that quality of genuine, unperformed attention she always gave her. "You are frequently right." "I know," Lily said without arrogance, "just another established fact." She opened her drawing pad to a blank page and got out the stubby pencil from the pad's spiral spine and started drawing something. The waiting room absorbed this addition without complaint. Nathan sat down in the chair on Lily's other side. The three of them sat in a row in the small waiting room of the Cedar Falls Clinic, which was not the mountain and was not the cabin and was not any of the spaces they'd shared over the past 3 days. And the ordinary fluorescent light of it and the pamphlets about flu prevention and the faint institutional smell of it were all aggressively normal in a way that underscored how not normal the past 3 days had been. He looked at the flu prevention pamphlets. He looked at his hands. He looked at Lily drawing. He did not look at Victoria, because he'd done enough looking at Victoria over the past 3 days to have a fairly complete picture, and adding to it in a clinic waiting room seemed unnecessary. "My mother's flying in from Vermont," Victoria said, to the space in front of her. He turned his head. "I called her from the SAR vehicle when we got signal. She was already 3/4 of the way to booking a flight by the time I finished telling her the situation." She paused. She doesn't respond to emergencies with restraint." That sounds like a good quality in a mother. "It's occasionally overwhelming." But the way she said it was not a complaint. It was something quieter than that. Something that sounded like someone who'd been alone long enough to have forgotten what it felt like to be descended upon by someone who loved them. "She'll be in Denver tomorrow morning. She wants to see the cabin." "It's not really viewable right now." "I told her that." "And?" "She said she didn't want to view it. She wanted to see where it happened." Victoria looked at him. "She's not really an abstract understanding person. She needs to put her feet in places." He thought about a woman who'd grown up on an apple farm in Vermont, who had a daughter who built impressive things and rarely called and was very good at being alone. "I'll make sure there's somewhere safe to stand," he said. Something moved across Victoria's face. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to the front. And that was how they left it. The doctor came out with the blood panel results at 5 o'clock. Mild anemia, consistent with the combination of cold exposure and reduced food intake. Nothing that required intervention beyond iron supplements and a recommendation to eat properly for the next 2 weeks, which the doctor delivered with the calibrated emphasis of someone who suspected her patient had a history of not eating properly. Victoria accepted this information and the prescription with the professional courtesy of someone who had sat in a lot of high-stakes rooms and knew how to receive information without arguing with it, even when she disagreed. Nathan drove her to the only hotel in Cedar Falls, which was a 20-room place called the Mountain Rest that had been there since 1987 and that he'd never personally had occasion to stay in, but that was considered adequate by regional standards. The rental car was following them, driven by a young man from the rental company who'd been waiting at the clinic with the quiet professional patience of someone who worked for people who expected this kind of flexibility. He pulled up in front of the hotel. The rental car pulled in behind him. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat somewhere on the 3-block drive, which was not as absurd as it sounded given the accumulated sleep deficit of 3 days. And she was leaning against the door with Captain Biscuit and her drawing pad still in her lap. "She's out," Victoria said, looking back. "She does this. Runs at full capacity until she just doesn't." Victoria looked at his sleeping daughter for a moment. In the particular quality of that look, Nathan saw the thing he'd been not quite looking at for 2 days. The genuine thing, underneath all the competence and the armor and the law firm emergency contact and the $400 million. What was under there was simply a person who had been lonely for a long time and was aware of it in a way that was too honest to be comfortable. He knew what that felt like from the inside. "I'll text you when I get to Denver tomorrow," she said, "after I pick up my mother." "Okay?" "And I want to contribute to the cabin repairs, not as, I'm not trying to fix it for you. I mean that I was there when it happened and I have resources you don't, and it's a reasonable thing." He'd expected this and had already worked out his answer. "The insurance will cover the structure. If there's a gap, I'll let you know." She absorbed this. That's a compromise. That's the one available. She almost smiled. "You're not easy." "I know what I am," he said. "You told me that the first night." Her almost smile completed itself briefly. She put her hand on the door handle. Then she stopped and reached into the pocket of his hunting jacket, which he now accepted, simply going to keep. And she brought out her phone and opened it and turned it to face him. On the screen was a photograph. He hadn't known she'd taken it. It was a picture of the kitchen table. The morning light was coming through the window. The second morning, he thought, based on the angle. Lily was sitting at the table with her granola and her library book, her head bent, completely absorbed. And at the edge of the frame, barely in the shot, were 2 coffee mugs side by side on the counter. That was all. It was not an impressive photograph by any technical standard, but it had the quality of something accidental and therefore true. The grain of the table, the particular way the morning light hit the mugs, the absolute unposed absorption of his daughter in her book. He looked at it for a moment. "I didn't know I was taking it," she said. It was there, and I was holding my phone, and then I had it." He looked at it a bit longer. "Send it to me," he said. She did. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Take care of that head," he said. "Take care of those fingers," she said. "Rosa told me about the frost nip." "Rosa talks too much." "Rosa is thorough." She opened the door. The cold came in immediately, the dry Cedar Falls cold that was nothing like the mountain cold but was cold enough to remind you of it. She got out and then leaned back in through the open door. "Nathan." "Yeah." She looked at him with the full attention look, the accountable look. "I meant what I said about using the number." "I know you did." "Okay." She straightened. She looked at Lily sleeping in the back, and something passed across her face that she didn't name and didn't need to. Then she closed the door and walked toward the hotel entrance, and the rental car came around and the young man held the door and she went inside. He sat in the truck outside the Mountain Rest Hotel for longer than he needed to. In the back seat, Lily slept. He took his phone out and opened the photo she'd sent. The kitchen table in the morning light, Lily's bent head, 2 mugs on the counter. He looked at it for a while, and then he locked his phone and put it in his pocket and started the truck. He drove the 3 blocks to Claire's mother's house. Margaret Wilson, 64, retired schoolteacher, who had been a constant and largely uncomplaining presence in his and Lily's life since Claire died, and who answered the door before he'd even knocked, because she'd been watching from the window. Margaret looked at him the way she always looked at him, with a blend of maternal assessment and the particular species of love that exists between people who are not related, but have been through the same loss. "You look awful," she said. "People keep telling me that." "Because it's true." She opened the door wide. "Get in here. I made soup." He carried Lily in over his shoulder. She weighed almost nothing at this angle, a warm, sleep-heavy bundle of kid, and Margaret held the door and made the soft, involuntary sound she always made when she saw her granddaughter, that sound that was about love but also about Claire, and that he had a theory she wasn't even aware of making. He put Lily on the couch in the front room, and Margaret covered her with the blanket that had lived on that couch for 30 years. And then she went to the kitchen to ladle soup, and Nathan sat in the armchair across from his sleeping daughter and stared at the ceiling. He could hear Margaret in the kitchen, the sounds of a woman at home in her space, the particular clunk of her soup ladle, the hiss of the burner being adjusted, the low running of the faucet, comfortable domestic sounds, the sounds of a life that had absorbed enormous loss and kept its rhythm anyway. He thought about what keeping your rhythm meant, what it cost, what it was worth. He took his phone out and looked at the photo again. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a bowl in each hand. She looked at him, then at the phone, then at him again. She had the eyes that Claire had gotten, gray-brown, watchful, the kind that missed less than they let on. "Who took that?" she asked. He turned the phone so she could see it. She looked at the photo for a moment. She was quiet in a way that was doing considerable work under its surface. "The woman from the blizzard," she said. It was not a question. "Yeah." Margaret looked at the photo for another moment. Then she handed him the soup and sat down on the couch next to Lily's feet and picked up her own bowl and didn't say anything else, which was one of the things he'd always respected about her. She knew when the question was in the room already without her help. He ate the soup. It was good soup, Margaret's vegetable, which she'd been making the same way for 40 years and which had been Claire's favorite. He ate all of it and didn't realize how hungry he'd been until it was gone. And then he sat with the empty bowl and looked at his sleeping daughter and thought about the photo on his phone and about a woman calling her mother from a county SAR vehicle and about pine cones and about how the things that mattered had a way of arriving through the doors you hadn't been watching. He didn't know what was going to happen. He told Victoria that honestly, and he meant it honestly. He genuinely did not know, and the not knowing was not the comfortable not knowing of someone who'd decided not to engage, but the alive, uncomfortable not knowing of someone who had started to care about the answer. That was a different feeling. He recognized it because it had been gone for long enough that its return was conspicuous. Lily shifted on the couch in her sleep and made a small sound and then stilled again, her hand closing briefly around air before relaxing. Margaret watched her granddaughter with the expression of someone doing the math of how fast time moved and not being entirely at peace with the answer. Outside, Cedar Falls was quiet in the way of small mountain towns after major storms. Not depressed, just taking stock. The plows were probably still running on secondary routes. Tomorrow people would dig out their cars and reopen their businesses, and the hardware store would sell snow shovels, and the diner would be full by 7 a.m., and by next week the blizzard would be the thing everyone talked about for the rest of the winter, and then gradually less, and then rarely. But for him, it was not going to become the thing you talked about less and less. He knew that with the simple certainty of someone who had learned to tell the difference between things that passed and things that changed the before and after line. He'd had one of those before, the morning he'd gotten the call about Claire, the moment that divided his life into what it had been and what it became. He wasn't comparing them. They weren't comparable, but the quality of the line was similar, a before and an after with something permanent in between. He sat in Margaret Wilson's front room with his empty soup bowl while his daughter slept, and he did not pretend he didn't know what he was feeling because he was 32 years old and he had already spent 4 years pretending, and he was done with that particular waste of time. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he'd added to his contacts that afternoon. It said, "My mother wants to know if she can bring anything for the cabin when she comes. She said," and I'm quoting, "people always need things after disasters. I tried to explain you were self-sufficient. She said that wasn't a real answer." He looked at the message for a moment. He typed back, "Tell her coffee, the good kind." We went through a lot of instant. The response came back in under a minute. "She says that's the most sensible thing she's heard in 3 days. She's also asking your last name. I told her Hale. She said it sounded like weather." He sat with the phone in his hand, and outside it was cold and inside it was warm, and his daughter was sleeping and Margaret was in the kitchen washing bowls, and something in his chest that had been in a particular compressed shape for a very long time had started, without permission, to take up slightly more space. He put the phone down, picked it back up, typed, "It does sound like weather," sent it, sat back, waited. The text continued for 3 days before they moved to phone calls. It started small. Practical things, the way it usually does when two people are navigating the space between what happened and what comes next without a map. She texted about the doctor's follow-up in Denver. He texted about the insurance adjuster's initial assessment of the cabin damage. She sent a photo of her mother at the Denver airport, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in a barn coat with a rolling suitcase and the expression of someone who had places to be. With the caption, "She brought 6 pounds of coffee and a cast-iron skillet. She said you'd need both." I didn't argue. He'd looked at that one for a while before responding. The phone call started on the 4th day, when she was back in San Francisco and he was in Margaret's guest room with Lily asleep down the hall, and she called at 9 p.m. his time because she'd miscalculated the time zone, and he'd answered anyway because he'd been awake. "I woke you," she said. "You didn't." A pause. You weren't asleep. No. Another pause, shorter. Good, neither was I. That call went 2 hours. He couldn't have told you afterward what they talked about, not in a list. It wasn't that kind of conversation. It didn't have topics so much as it had direction, a meandering through things that mattered without announcing itself as meaningful. She told him about going back to her apartment and standing in it for 10 minutes before she could make herself unpack her bag. He told her about Lily's first morning back at school and how she'd told her class about the cabin collapse, with the same tone she'd used to report a science fact, and how her teacher had called him afterward to make sure everything was okay, and how he'd had to explain that yes, everything was okay. Lily just processed things by narrating them to available audiences. She laughed at that. A real laugh. The same one he'd first heard in his kitchen, short and surprised and genuine. He'd learned it by then. He knew the difference between her real laugh and the social version, which was more measured and arrived with less surprise. The real one always caught her slightly off guard. After that first call, they talked every day. Not always long, sometimes 15 minutes between her meetings and his work schedule, sometimes just long enough to establish that the other person was still there. He wasn't sure when it stopped feeling like two people trying to maintain a connection across distance and started feeling like something more structural than that. But at some point, it did. The first time she came back to Colorado was 3 weeks after the blizzard. She called from Denver International on a Thursday morning without having announced she was coming. "I have a meeting in Aspen on Friday," she said when he picked up. "I thought I'd come up a day early." "You have a meeting in Aspen?" "My company does some work with a resort group there. It's legitimate." "I didn't say it wasn't. You used a tone." "I don't have a tone. You have several tones." This was the skeptical one. A pause. "I also just wanted to see the cabin. And Cedar Falls. In daylight, without a blizzard." He picked her up from Cedar Falls at 2 in the afternoon, which was the closest he could get to her rental car's location given the road conditions, and she got into his truck with a travel bag over her shoulder and a different coat than the borrowed hunting jacket and her hair down, and she looked different in his truck in the afternoon winter light than she had looked anywhere else. More real, somehow, and also more uncertain, like someone who'd made a decision in a warm room and had arrived at the destination of it and was now doing the arithmetic of whether the decision was still correct. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They drove up the service road, which had been fully cleared now, the county crew having done a proper pass. She looked out the window at the mountains going past and didn't say much, and he didn't fill the silence because he'd learned that her silences had content to them, and filling them was usually the wrong call. The cabin looked different in the post-storm daylight. The collapsed north section was covered by his tarps, which were now weighted with new snow, and the exposed timber framing of the damage was visible against the sky in a way that was structurally ugly, but somehow also honest. The damage shone plainly rather than hidden. He'd spent 2 weeks doing what he could solo before the season made further work impractical, and come spring he'd have a crew up here. The bones were good. He'd said that from the beginning, and it was still true. Victoria stood in the yard and looked at it. She stood there long enough that he stopped watching her and looked at the cabin himself, trying to see it the way she was seeing it. New eyes, first time in daylight, the full scale of what had happened visible in a way it hadn't been when she was inside it, living through it. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "The damage. North section's a full rebuild. Everything else is repair work." "How long?" "If I start in April and the crew's available, end of summer realistically. Could be September." She nodded. She walked around the perimeter, which he hadn't expected. A full circuit, looking at the walls, the foundation line, the cedar storage shed that had come through untouched. She was doing what she'd done with the debris work during the storm, spatial assessment, seeing where things were and what they required. When she came back around to where he was standing, she said, "I want to be here when you rebuild it." He looked at her. "Not to supervise," she said quickly. "I know you don't need that, and I wouldn't. I want to be here. Physically. For part of it." She looked at the structure. "I was here when it came down. I'd like to be here when it goes back up." He thought about what that meant practically. San Francisco was 3 hours by air from Denver, then 90 minutes by car from Denver up to Cedar Falls. It was not around the corner. "That's a lot of traveling," he said. "I have a plane." He looked at her. A company plane, she said. It sounds more… I know how it sounds. It just makes the distance more manageable than it looks on a map. He was quiet for a moment, not because he was reluctant, but because he was being honest with himself about what was being offered here, and he wanted to receive it honestly. This was not someone proposing a casual weekend arrangement. This was someone saying, I intend to show up. He knew the difference. He'd spent 4 years knowing the difference. Okay, he said. Okay. Okay, be here when we rebuild it. She looked at him with a quality he'd come to think of as her recalibration expression. The one that appeared when something landed that she'd been prepared for not landing. That was easier than I expected. Did you want it to be harder? No. A pause. I prepared arguments. Save them. You might need them later. She did something with her mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and they went inside to see what was left of the interior. She met Lily at Margaret's that evening for dinner. Margaret had made pot roast, which was her position on important occasions. Pot roast being her culinary statement of intent, the dish she deployed when she wanted to communicate that something mattered. Nathan had not told Margaret to make pot roast. Margaret had made that decision independently, which told him something about what Margaret had concluded was happening. Lily was not surprised to see Victoria. She'd known Victoria was coming because Nathan had told her that morning, and she'd received this information with a thoughtful pause and then a question about whether Victoria would want to see the new drawings she'd done. And Nathan had said probably yes, and Lily had said okay, and gone back to her breakfast. She showed Victoria the drawings after dinner, spread across Margaret's kitchen table in the particular order that Lily had decided was correct. There were more of them now. The original cabin series, the ridge drawing, the kitchen table picture, and new additions from the 3 weeks since, the SAR vehicle, the Cedar Falls Clinic waiting room, a detailed rendering of Captain Biscuit from an angle that emphasized the rabbit's philosophical expression. Victoria went through them slowly, giving each one real attention. Lily sat next to her and provided context where she deemed it necessary and was otherwise quiet, which was her version of high respect. This one, Victoria said, stopping at the kitchen table drawing, the 3 figures sitting at the table, the morning light through the window. How did you know what to put in the corner? Lily looked at the corner of the drawing where she'd added a small rectangle that he now understood was meant to be the pine cone on the windowsill. Because it was there, she said. I try to put in what was there. Victoria looked at the drawing for another moment. You're a very good observer. I know, Lily said. Daddy says I see things. He's right. He usually is, Lily said, except about the granola. He says I eat too much of it, but that's because he doesn't understand the correct amount. Margaret, who was washing dishes with her back to the table and who Nathan had assumed was not listening, made a small sound that was her way of laughing without fully committing to it. He looked at her back and she didn't turn around. That night, after Lily was asleep and Margaret had excused herself with the transparent tact of a woman who understood when other people needed a room to themselves, Nathan and Victoria sat at Margaret's kitchen table with the remnants of the pot roast dinner around them and talked for 2 hours about things that were not practical and not logistical, about what the next year might look like, and what they were willing to do about the distance, and what Lily needed and didn't need, and what the right pace of things was for a 7-year-old who had already absorbed more change than most kids her age. He did most of the talking on the Lily section of things because it was his territory, and she understood that, and she listened the way she listened to things that mattered, completely, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. She's not fragile, he said. I don't want you to think I'm asking you to walk on eggshells. She's more resilient than most adults I know, but she attaches. When she decides someone is real, they're real, and if that person leaves, it leaves a mark. He stopped. That's all I'm saying. I understand, Victoria said. Do you? Yes. She held his gaze steadily. I'm not going to disappear, Nathan. I don't know how to promise that in a way that feels sufficient because I know that promises are just words until they're backed by time. But I'm telling you the intention clearly so that if I ever fail to live up to it, you have standing to call me on it. He looked at her. In the kitchen light, in Margaret's house, with the pot roast smell still in the air, she looked like herself. Not the controlled version, not the armor version, just the actual person underneath all of that, who was sharp and complicated and had a very large pile and a tendency to run, and who had, for reasons he was still taking stock of, decided to stop running in the direction of his mountain. "Okay," he said, "I'm holding you to that. I expect you to." She flew to Aspen for her meeting the next morning. She was back in Cedar Falls by Saturday afternoon. That was the weekend the pattern established itself. The months that followed were not a smooth progression. Anyone who wanted to tell this story as a smooth progression would have to leave out the Friday night in March when they had an actual argument. Not a conflict or a tension, but a real argument, voices raised, Nathan saying things more bluntly than he should have, about the way her work kept expanding into weekends, and Lily kept noticing the missed calls, and Victoria saying things more sharply than she should have about the difference between being needed and being managed. And both of them sitting with the silence after that, knowing they'd both been right about parts of it and wrong about others, and having to find their way back from that without a script. It took 2 days. It wasn't pretty. They figured it out. Anyone who wanted to tell this story cleanly would also have to leave out the morning in April when Lily came into the kitchen at Margaret's where Nathan was on the phone with Victoria and stood in the doorway listening with an expression he couldn't read, and later that night said, "Is Victoria going to live here?" And he'd said he didn't know, and she'd said, "I think she should," and then gone to bed, leaving him standing in the hallway with that sentence still in the air. He called Victoria after Lily was asleep and told her what Lily had said. There was a pause on the line. Then Victoria said, "Your daughter has better judgment than most of my board. She really does. I've been thinking about it too," she said, "about what here looks like. And I think it involves a conversation about what I'm doing with my company, which is a conversation I've been needing to have with myself for longer than I've been willing to admit." That conversation took another month to fully develop, not because she was avoiding it, but because it was genuinely complex. She didn't walk away from her company the way people walked away from things in stories, cleanly and with a clean conscience. She had 140 employees and investors and obligations, and a board that had given her resources in exchange for accountability. What she did was slower and more deliberate than walking away. She spent 3 months working with her executive team to build a leadership structure that didn't require her to be the center of gravity. She promoted her COO to co-CEO. She stepped back from day-to-day operations while retaining her founder's role and board seat. She restructured her own schedule from the 70-hour weeks of the previous 5 years to something that had edges to it, something that stopped. She told him about it on a Thursday in May, standing in what remained of the cabin yard while the first crew was up doing structural assessment on the north section rebuild. He'd asked her to come up for the start of the rebuild, and she'd come. And they were standing in the morning mountain light watching 2 carpenters argue quietly but intensely about header specifications, and she told him what she'd decided. He listened. He didn't say anything until she was done. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes." "Because you don't have to." "Nathan." She said his name the way he'd said hers, that first night in his kitchen. "Stop talking. Just accept the thing." "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I've been drowning in something I built, and I'd rather rebuild what actually matters." She looked at the cabin structure. "You taught me that, actually, without teaching it." "I didn't teach you anything. You showed me something, which is different." She put her hands in her pockets. "There's a version of succeeding at things that's just very elaborate hiding. I was very good at it. I don't want to be good at it anymore." He looked at the mountain, then at her. "What do you want to be good at?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things that deserved seriousness. "Being present," she said, "the kind that doesn't require a crisis to produce." He nodded. Then he looked back at the carpenters who had resolved their header disagreement and were measuring, and he said, "The pine cone's going in the north beam when they do the first header." She looked at him. "Which one?" "Both. I have both." She looked at the structure for a moment, at the framing going up against the mountain sky, and something moved across her face that was too layered to name, grief and something like repair existing in the same space, the way they always did when things were built from what was broken. "Good," she said. The rebuild took until the second week of September, which was later than he'd hoped and faster than Margaret had predicted, and roughly what Carol Briggs had called it when he'd come up in April to look at the structure. The crew was 5 men working 3 days a week through the summer, and Nathan worked alongside them on every day they were there. And Victoria came up on weekends when she could and learned what she could participate in without being in the way, which turned out to be more than he'd expected. She had the farmer's daughter in her still, under everything else. She knew how to work with her hands, and she knew how to take direction, and she knew which conversations to have and which ones to stay out of. Lily spent the summer between Margaret's and the construction site, the latter with specific limitations that Nathan had established clearly and that she mostly observed. She had opinions about the rebuild that she expressed freely, primarily about the window placement in the north section, which she felt should face the ridge view rather than the driveway, an argument that turned out to be aesthetically correct and that Nathan eventually incorporated, crediting his daughter to the crew with the flat matter-of-factness of a man who knew when he'd been out-argued. Victoria noticed this and told him later that he was a good father. He said he was a father who was doing his best, which was not the same thing. She said it was closer to the same thing than he thought. He said she was being generous. She said, "You do this thing where someone gives you an accurate observation about yourself and you immediately find a way to make it slightly less than accurate. It's a habit, and it's an annoying one." He thought about that for 2 days and concluded she was right, and told her so, and she said she knew she was right, and he told her that was an annoying habit of hers, and she said she was working on it. That was in July. By August, they had figured out how to argue and come back from it without the 2 days of cold distance, which was not a small thing, and which both of them understood was not a small thing, though neither of them said this directly. Margaret watched all of this with the gray-brown eyes she'd given to Claire, and that Claire had given to Lily, and she said less than she saw and more than was comfortable on the occasions she did speak. In August, she told Nathan, over coffee in her kitchen while Lily was outside with Victoria looking at something in the garden, that she thought Claire would have liked Victoria. He said he'd thought the same thing. Margaret said, "She'd have liked her specifically because Victoria doesn't need anything from you. Claire was always suspicious of people who needed things." He said that was accurate. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the window and said, "You don't have to ask me anything, Nathan. You know what I think." He did know. He'd known since the pot roast. The cabin was finished on a Saturday in mid-September. The crew did the final walkthrough on Friday, and Nathan spent Saturday morning going through every room. The original south and east sections restored, the new north section rebuilt with better pitch and better materials than his grandfather had used, the interior spaces open and warm and smelling of new wood and linseed oil. The kitchen was the same wood stove on the kitchen side of the main room, the same table from the cedar that had survived. The front room was new, different dimensions, slightly larger, the window on the north wall facing the ridge exactly where Lily had said it should face. In the first new header beam of the north section, embedded in a notch that the head carpenter had cut without asking why Nathan wanted it done that way, were 2 pine cones. Closed tight, pressed together in the wood, where they would stay for as long as the structure stood. Victoria came up that Saturday afternoon. She'd driven herself this time. She'd bought a truck in June, a 4-wheel drive that was more practical than her rental habit, and that had required genuine discussion because she'd initially tried to buy something impractical, and he'd told her plainly what the roads were like in winter, and she'd listened, which he'd found quietly meaningful. She walked through the cabin the same way he had that morning, room by room, taking it in. He followed at a distance, letting her look. She stopped in the front room at the north window and looked at the ridge view. She stood there for a while. "Lily was right," she said. "She usually is, about visual things especially." Victoria turned from the window and looked at the room, the new walls, the ceiling with the beam visible where the pine cones were embedded. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the damage in February, the morning after the collapse, with that practical spatial intelligence, but differently too, with something personal in it. "It doesn't look like a different cabin," she said. "It looks like the same cabin that got better." He thought that was probably the most accurate description of the rebuild he'd heard. He thought it was also possibly a description of other things, but he didn't say that because he wasn't 17 and he didn't need to say everything out loud. "Stay tonight," he said. She looked at him. "You and me and Lily, first night back in the cabin. Margaret's making pot roast. She'll come up, bring Lily." He paused. "I'd like you here for it." "Okay?" she said. "Just okay?" "Yes, just okay." She looked at him directly. "I'd like to be here for it." Margaret came up at 5 with pot roast in a covered dish, and Lily in the passenger seat and the cast iron skillet that Victoria's mother had sent, which had been living at Margaret's for 7 months, and which was now ceremonially transferred to the cabin kitchen where it belonged. Lily walked through the cabin with the focused attention of her cabin drawing practice. Every room, every detail, already composing it in her head. She stopped at the north window. "I was right," she said. "You were right," Nathan told her. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose spatial judgment had been vindicated and went to find Captain Biscuit, who had made the journey in her backpack. They ate at the kitchen table, 4 of them, which was not a configuration the table had held before, and which should have felt crowded, but didn't. Margaret had opinions about the new kitchen layout that she delivered with the directness of a woman who had earned her opinions on kitchens, and Victoria engaged with these opinions seriously, and Lily contributed thoughts about where the granola should be stored in the new cabinet configuration, and Nathan ate pot roast and looked at the people at his table and let himself feel the full weight of what he was looking at without immediately doing something defensive with it. This was harder than it sounded. He'd spent 4 years managing his own interior states with something close to efficiency. Not suppression, not avoidance, but a kind of rationing. Allowing himself to feel things in measured doses because the full doses had been, for a while, too much. He'd gotten so good at the rationing that it had started to feel like the natural state of things, like the full dose was not actually available to him anymore. It was available. He could feel that it was available. Sitting at his table in his rebuilt cabin with the ridge view in the north window and the pine cones in the beam and his daughter explaining granola storage with complete earnestness, and the woman who had arrived in his life through a near catastrophe sitting across from him looking more at home than she probably knew she looked. The full dose was entirely available, and he let himself have it. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was the feeling of a room that had been closed for a long time being opened. It had an ache to it alongside the warmth, and that was correct, and he didn't try to separate the two. Margaret went home at 8 with the dish and her pot roast opinions, and a look at Nathan on the porch that said more than she would ever put into words. And he held the door for her, and she patted his arm once on the way out, the way she'd done since he was 26 years old, and didn't need it less now at 32. Lily fell asleep on the couch, the new couch, a practical gray one that he'd bought in June and that had not yet acquired the particular character of lived-in furniture, but wood, with Captain Biscuit and her drawing pad. She'd been drawing the cabin all evening, the new version. He could see the north window in the drawing and the ridge beyond it, and the beam with something in it that was meant to be the pine cones, though at the scale she was working at, they were small and suggested rather than detailed. He covered her. She didn't stir. He went and stood in the front room in the dark, looking out the north window at the ridge where the snow had come back. First snow of the season, light as yet, just a dusting on the peaks that would build through October into something serious. The moon was up and it lit the snow blue-white and the pines black beneath it, and the sky above was the same hard-scoured alpine clarity it had been the morning after the blizzard, when he'd looked out and known the storm was over. Victoria came and stood beside him. They looked at the ridge together and didn't say anything for a while. He was aware of her the way he'd become aware of her, specifically, precisely, with the particular attention you gave to people you'd decided were yours to pay attention to. "I'm going to call my mother tomorrow," she said. "Good. She's been asking about coming to see the cabin." "She can come any time." "She'll want to rearrange the kitchen." "Margaret already rearranged the kitchen." "Then they'll either agree perfectly or fight about it, and either way it'll be fine." He almost smiled. "Your mother and Margaret would probably get along." "I think so too." A pause. "That's a strange thought." "Is it bad strange or good strange?" She thought about it. "Good," she said. "Unfamiliar, good." They stood in the quiet for another moment. Outside, the moonlight moved slightly as a cloud crossed it, and the shadows shifted on the ridge, and the first snow on the peaks glittered and went still. He had something he'd been carrying for a while that he'd been waiting for the right time to put down. He'd been waiting not because he was afraid. He'd passed afraid somewhere around the conversation with Margaret in August. But because the right moment and the forced moment were different things, and he'd wanted the right one. This was the right one. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt. Not the coat, the shirt, the one he'd worn to the cabin that morning because it was where he'd put it, and he brought out a ring. Not an elaborate ring. A silver band with a single dark stone, the color of mountain water in October that he'd found in a small jewelry shop in Cedar Falls run by a woman who'd been making her own pieces for 30 years. He'd gone in looking for something and found this one and known immediately, the way you knew things that were right, not from thinking about it, but from the absence of doubt. He held it where she could see it in the moonlight. Victoria looked at it. She looked at it for a long time, the way she looked at things that required actual consideration rather than the performed consideration of someone going through motions. He waited because her silence had never been empty, and he'd learned to give it room. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah. You're very direct." "I know what I am." She looked at the ring and then at him, and what was on her face was not the composed, controlled surface he'd met on his couch in February. What was on her face was the thing underneath all of that. The person who called her mother and had a very large pile and had spent 3 years running and had found her way, by way of black ice and a blizzard and a single chrome reflection in his headlights, to a kitchen table with 2 coffee mugs in the morning light. "Yes," she said. Just that. No speech, no conditions, no qualifications. He'd half expected conditions. He knew her, and conditions were her natural mode when she was being careful. But she said yes the way Lily had nodded at the breakfast agenda, the way Nathan had told Carol the radio was fixed, the way things got said between people who'd gotten past needing to manage each impression, simply and meaning it completely. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He'd guessed her size from a ring she sometimes wore on her right hand, and he'd guessed correctly, which felt like the kind of thing you didn't mention because it would sound like you were congratulating yourself, but which he privately noted with the satisfaction of a man who paid attention. She looked at her hand, then at him. "When did you get this?" "August." "August." "I wasn't going to wait until I was more sure. I was already sure." She looked at him with that expression he loved the most, the one that appeared when something landed that she'd been holding herself back from wanting. "I've been sure for longer than August," she said quietly. "I know." You knew?" "I have a daughter who sees things," he said. "It's catching." She did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed, and then she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the front room of the rebuilt cabin, looking at the moonlit ridge through the north window that faced the right direction because a 7-year-old had said so. From the couch, faintly, Lily made the small sound she made in deep sleep. Content. Untroubled. Present in the way only children could be present. Not in the past, not in the future, just here, in the good warm center of the things she'd decided to include in her drawings months ago because it was there and she put in what was there. They married the following June. Not a large wedding, small by the standards of someone with Victoria's resources and connections, which meant about 40 people. Margaret, who cried with the practical efficiency of someone who had been expecting to cry and had planned accordingly. Carol Briggs and his wife, who brought a bottle of whiskey from a distillery in Denver that Carol said was the good kind, which Nathan interpreted as meaning it was expensive and accepted graciously. Victoria's mother, Ellen, who had indeed rearranged the kitchen on her first visit and had been right to do so, and who stood at the front of the assembled people on the mountain with the expression of a woman whose daughter had finally, after a considerable delay, found her way somewhere real. Victoria's CFO and 2 college friends and a few others who had been consistent enough in her life to qualify as witnesses to it. The wedding was outside, on the flat ground in front of the cabin, in June mountain sunshine that was warm enough without being hot, the kind of day the Rockies produced a handful of times each summer, as if to justify everything else they put you through the rest of the year. The ridge was visible behind the cabin, the same ridge with its aspens and pines that Nathan had been looking at his whole life, that Lily had drawn into pictures, that Victoria had stood looking at from the north window in the moonlight the night he'd asked her. Lily was the one who carried the rings. She'd been asked and had accepted with the gravity of someone undertaking a professional responsibility. She wore a dress that she'd chosen herself, dark blue, practical, no ruffles, which was consistent with her aesthetic positions generally, and she walked between the assembled people with Captain Biscuit in one arm and the ring pillow in the other hand with a focus that suggested she had decided the rings were her primary responsibility, and Captain Biscuit was secondary but important. She delivered the rings correctly and then stood next to Margaret for the rest of the ceremony with the expression of someone who had decided this was the correct outcome and was satisfied to see it confirmed. Nathan looked at Victoria in the mountain light and said the things that needed to be said, simply, without a speech he'd written. He was not a speech-written person, and she knew that about him and would not have wanted a written speech anyway. He said what was true, that he hadn't been looking for this and hadn't expected it, and that it had found him the way the things that mattered always found him, through a door he wasn't watching. That he was not easy, and she was not easy, and they'd already proven they could get through that, and he intended to keep proving it. That he had loved someone before with everything he had and lost her, and that losing her had taught him something he hadn't known how to learn any other way, that the capacity for it didn't go, that it remained, that it was available in full, and he was giving it. Victoria said what was true, that she had spent years being very good at things and very alone, and that alone had become so familiar she'd stopped recognizing it as a choice. That a blizzard and a broken roof and a 7-year-old with a drawing pad had shown her what she'd been working so hard not to see. That she was done running, not because she'd decided to stop, but because she'd found something worth staying for. That she intended to be here. Fully here. For all of it. Ellen Ashcroft cried. Margaret Wilson cried. Carol Briggs looked at the mountains, and his jaw worked in a way that was its own version of the same thing. Lily did not cry. She watched with the careful attention of a person archiving things for later, and when Nathan and Victoria kissed, she looked at Margaret and said quietly but audibly, "I told you." Margaret put an arm around her. "You did," she said. "You absolutely did." 2 years after the wedding, Victoria called him from the clinic in Cedar Falls, a different clinic visit than the one in February 2 years prior, under different circumstances entirely, and told him what the doctor had said, and he sat down on the steps of the rebuilt cabin porch and put his face in his hands and stayed like that for a while, which was his version of enormous feeling that didn't have another container. They had a daughter in October. They named her Clara, close to Claire but not the same, which was intentional, an acknowledgement without an exact echo. Lily accepted this addition to the household with the same methodical seriousness she'd applied to everything, including a 2-week period of assessment during which she evaluated Clara's qualities and potential before announcing that she thought the baby would be all right. Nathan took this as the high endorsement it was. He found himself on an ordinary Tuesday morning in early December, Lily at school, Clara asleep in the room that had been rebuilt as the nursery in the new north section, Victoria downstairs on a call that was shorter than her calls used to be, standing at the north window looking at the ridge. Snow on the peaks again. First real snow of the season, heavier than last year's early dusting, settling in for the long winter in the way the mountain did it. He stood there thinking about a night 4 years ago when he'd seen a reflection in his headlights on a road he hadn't needed to be on. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and all the things that had gone wrong in between, and all the things that had held, the roof that had come down, the arguments they'd had and recovered from, the calls from San Francisco at 9 p.m., his time, the ring he'd carried in his shirt pocket for 2 months before the right moment, the pine cones in the beam above him. He thought about what he'd believed for 4 years after Claire, about the shape his life had taken, the finished quality of it, the completeness of the loss and the incompleteness of what remained. He hadn't been wrong, exactly. He'd been right about where he was. He'd just been wrong about whether where he was where he'd stay. He heard Victoria's call end downstairs, the particular silence of a completed conversation. He heard her footsteps in the kitchen. He heard the coffee maker, and then the small sound of the cabinet where the mugs were, the The cabinet that was in the same place it had always been because some things you didn't move even when you rebuilt everything around them. He stayed at the window a moment longer. The ridge was the same ridge it had always been. The aspens, the pines, the granite shelf where he'd found the pine cone that was now in the beam of his own house. The mountain that didn't care if you were having a bad day, which his daughter had correctly identified as actually nice. The same mountain he'd been looking at his whole life, and which looked different now, and which was unchanged. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving the worst thing. Not that it got better, though it did. Not that you healed, though you did, imperfectly and slowly and with more backtracking than the stories suggested. The thing nobody told you was that the world that came after was made of the same materials as the world before. Same mountain, same cold, same human tendency toward isolation and running and keeping the hurt safe instead of letting it go. Same capacity for love that didn't diminish with loss but went sideways, underground, waiting. What changed was not the materials. What changed was what you built with them. He turned from the window and went downstairs to where his wife was pouring coffee and his daughter was sleeping and the wood stove was doing its steady, reliable work against the December cold outside. He had both mugs down from the cabinet before she'd asked for them. She looked at him over her shoulder and didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth did the thing it did, and he handed her the coffee and she took it. And outside the snow kept coming down on the mountain that had brought them to each other, and that would outlast them both, and that did not require their gratitude and received it anyway.